You've been taught that control is peace, that if you manage everything, plan everything, and hold everything together, you'll finally feel safe. But if that were true, why does your mind never rest? Why do you feel tense even when things are fine? And why does letting go feel more frightening than losing? The truth is, peace doesn't come from control. It comes when you stop fighting reality. Buddhist wisdom has been pointing to this truth for centuries. The Buddha taught that suffering begins the moment we demand life be different, the moment we cling, the moment we resist what is, and that freedom begins when we release the need to control. You try to control because uncertainty feels dangerous, because not knowing feels like falling, because silence feels like emptiness. But what if uncertainty is not your enemy? What if emptiness is not loss? And what if letting go is where peace has been waiting all along? Tonight, as you listen, your grip will loosen, your breath will soften, and your mind will stop negotiating with life. You'll begin to see how much effort it takes to control outcomes, manage emotions, and force clarity before it's ready. This is not about giving up. This is not about becoming passive or weak. This is acceptance, the kind that creates inner stability even when the world remains uncertain. This is not just something to hear, it's something to feel, something your body remembers even if your mind has forgotten. When you release the need to control, you don't lose yourself, you find peace. Are you ready to stop holding on and finally allow life to be? Let's begin. Something subtle happens right after the idea of letting go enters your awareness. A quiet resistance shows up, not loud, not dramatic, just a tightening inside the chest or jaw, a thought that whispers, "If I stop controlling this, something will go wrong." This response is not a personal failure, it is not weakness. It is a deeply ingrained survival response shaped long before modern life existed. The need for control was not born from ego or personality, it came from survival. Early human minds learned to stay alive by predicting threats and reducing uncertainty. The ability to anticipate danger, dominate surroundings, and maintain order meant the difference between life and death. Control equaled safety. That equation became wired into the nervous system. And even though your life no longer depends on constant vigilance, your body still reacts as if it does. Today, uncertainty rarely threatens your physical survival, yet your nervous system responds to it as though it does. A delayed reply triggers anxiety. A change in plans feels destabilizing. Silence feels unsafe. Loss of clarity feels dangerous. The mind reacts automatically by tightening its grip, trying to organize, manage, and dominate what it cannot fully predict. This is where the illusion of control takes hold. The mind begins to believe that safety comes from dominance rather than presence. It assumes that if it can just control enough variables, it will finally relax. But control does not calm the system. It keeps it alert. It keeps it braced. It keeps it scanning for the next threat. Control feels productive, but it is driven by fear. It is the mind saying, "I don't trust life to unfold without my interference." This is why control never feels complete. There is always another variable to manage, another possibility to prepare for, another outcome to prevent. Even during moments that should feel calm, part of you remains tense, waiting. The nervous system cannot distinguish between real danger and imagined threat. When the mind rehearses worst-case scenarios, the body responds as if they are already happening. Stress hormones are released, muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow. Control keeps the body in a low-grade fight-or-flight state. This is why chronic controlling tendencies often coexist with exhaustion. Buddhist teachings identify this pattern clearly. They explain that suffering arises not from uncertainty itself, but from resistance to it. The mind resists by clinging, by grasping, by trying to force stability where none exists. This resistance keeps the nervous system activated. It signals danger even when there is none. Relinquishing control does not remove uncertainty, it removes the internal war against it. That is the difference. When resistance drops, the body receives a new signal. Not everything is safe, but I am not fighting this moment. That signal allows the nervous system to settle. Inner security is often misunderstood. It is not a guarantee that nothing will go wrong. It is not confidence that life will behave. Inner security is trust in your capacity to meet whatever happens without abandoning yourself. Control externalizes safety. Acceptance internalizes it. The urge to control often arises before anything has actually happened. You plan conversations before they occur. You manage emotions before they surface. You anticipate rejection before it exists. This is not foresight. It is fear attempting to protect itself by dominating the future. But the future cannot be dominated. It can only be imagined. And imagination, when fueled by fear, becomes a source of suffering. Control turns imagined threats into lived stress. Acceptance allows uncertainty to remain uncertain. The mind uses control to avoid feeling. If you stay busy managing outcomes, you don't have to sit with discomfort. If you stay in charge, you don't have to feel vulnerable. Control is a strategy for emotional avoidance, but what is avoided does not disappear. It accumulates. Unfelt emotions settle into the body. They show up as tension, restlessness, irritability, and chronic anxiety. Control keeps emotions suspended. Acceptance allows them to move. Movement is how emotions resolve. Letting go of control often feels unsafe at first because it removes a familiar coping mechanism. Even if that mechanism is exhausting, it is known. The nervous system prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar peace. This is why people often return to controlling habits after moments of release, not because control works, but because it feels predictable. Acceptance introduces something unfamiliar: openness. Openness includes sensation, emotion, and uncertainty. But openness is also where regulation happens. When emotions are allowed rather than managed, they complete their natural cycle. They rise, peak, and fall. Control interrupts this cycle. It traps emotions mid-process. This is why controlled people often feel emotionally stagnant. Nothing fully resolves. Everything lingers. Buddhist psychology explains that clinging creates suffering because it places safety outside the present moment. When peace depends on outcomes, approval, or certainty, the mind is constantly negotiating with reality. Negotiation keeps tension alive. Allowance dissolves it. Relinquishing control does not mean doing nothing. It means responding rather than reacting. Reaction comes from fear. Response comes from presence. Presence does not rush. It does not dominate. It meets what is actually happening. Notice how control is future-oriented. It lives in what if. Acceptance lives in what is. The nervous system can regulate in the present. It cannot regulate in imagined futures. This is why acceptance feels grounding. When you allow a moment to be exactly as it is, even if it is uncomfortable, something stabilizes inside. The breath slows, muscles soften, the mind becomes less noisy. Not because the situation changed, but because resistance dropped. This is how inner security forms. It is built through repeated experiences of allowing discomfort without collapsing. Each time you stay present instead of controlling, the nervous system learns a new pattern. It learns that uncertainty is survivable. It learns that sensation passes. It learns that you remain intact. Control narrows life. Acceptance expands it. Control requires constant effort. Acceptance conserves energy. Control is tense. Acceptance is alert without strain. There is a common fear that without control, chaos will take over. But chaos is not the absence of control. Chaos is the absence of awareness. Acceptance does not remove awareness. It sharpens it. When you are no longer busy managing imaginary threats, you become more attuned to what is actually happening. This clarity allows for wiser action. Action that arises from clarity is more effective than action driven by fear. Control acts too early. Acceptance waits for reality to speak. Letting go of control also changes how you relate to yourself. Control is often harsh. It demands performance. It punishes mistakes. Acceptance introduces gentleness. Gentleness is not indulgence. It is accuracy. It meets the nervous system where it is instead of forcing it where it is not ready to go. This gentleness restores trust. Trust in the body, trust in awareness, trust that you can feel without breaking. That trust is the foundation of peace. Inner security does not feel dramatic. It is subtle. It feels like less effort, fewer internal arguments, fewer rehearsals, more space between thoughts. It does not mean the absence of difficulty. It means the absence of constant defense. The illusion of control collapses slowly, not through force, but through experience. Each time you release control and discover that you are still okay, the belief weakens. Over time, the nervous system stops equating dominance with safety. Peace does not arrive as an achievement. It emerges as a byproduct of non-resistance. When you stop trying to manage life into a shape it cannot hold, the energy used for control becomes available for presence. Presence is what makes life feel livable. It is what allows rest without collapse and engagement without anxiety. Presence does not require certainty. It requires honesty with what is here. The illusion of control promised safety. Acceptance delivers stability, not because the world becomes predictable, but because you stop needing it to be. As the grip of control softens, a new discomfort often appears. Not fear this time, but confusion. If control creates tension and acceptance brings relief, then why does acceptance sometimes sound like giving up? Why does it feel close to weakness? This misunderstanding is one of the biggest reasons people return to control even after tasting peace. There is a quiet fear beneath the word acceptance, a fear that says, if I accept this, nothing will change. A fear that says, if I stop resisting, I will stay stuck. This fear is understandable, but it is based on a false idea. Acceptance is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is not surrendering your life to chaos. True acceptance is something far more active, far more grounded, and far more powerful. Acceptance begins where denial ends. Denial is exhausting. It requires constant mental effort to pretend something is not happening, should not be happening, or must be changed immediately. The body feels denial as tension. The jaw tightens, the breath shortens, the mind races. Acceptance, by contrast, starts with honesty. It says, this is what is happening right now. Nothing more, nothing less. This honesty is stabilizing. When you stop arguing with reality, your energy returns to the present moment. That energy is what makes wise action possible. Control rushes, avoidance freezes, acceptance grounds. Many people confuse acceptance with approval. They think accepting something means liking it, agreeing with it, or allowing harm to continue. This is not what acceptance means in Buddhist understanding. Acceptance means acknowledging reality as it is before deciding how to respond. It is the pause that allows clarity to emerge. When you skip acceptance, action becomes reactive. You act from fear, anger, or urgency. These actions may feel strong, but they are often misaligned. They create more problems than they solve. Acceptance slows the process just enough for wisdom to enter. There is a concept in Buddhism often called the middle way. It is not a compromise between extremes. It is a path that avoids both force and avoidance. Control is one extreme, passivity is the other. Acceptance lives between them. Control tries to dominate reality, passivity collapses under it. Acceptance meets reality without aggression or withdrawal. It says, this is here, and I am here with it. From that place, action becomes responsive instead of compulsive. Avoidance often disguises itself as acceptance. People say they are accepting when they are actually numbing, distracting, or withdrawing. True acceptance does not disconnect you from experience. It connects you more deeply. You feel more, not less. You notice more, not less. This is why acceptance can feel uncomfortable at first. It removes the shields. You become aware of sensations, emotions, and thoughts that control and avoidance kept at a distance. But awareness is not harm. Awareness is how the system processes experience. When you accept an emotion, you allow it to exist without trying to fix it. This does not make the emotion stronger, it allows it to complete its natural cycle. Emotions that are resisted persist. Emotions that are allowed move. Wise action grows out of this movement. When emotions are processed instead of suppressed, they stop hijacking behavior. You are no longer acting from unexamined fear or unresolved anger. You are acting from clarity. Acceptance also changes how you relate to effort. Control is effortful. It strains. Passivity withdraws effort completely. Acceptance uses effort wisely. It applies energy where it matters and releases it where it does not. For example, acceptance recognizes the difference between what can be influenced and what cannot. It does not waste energy fighting facts. It also does not abandon responsibility where action is possible. It responds appropriately. This discernment is impossible without acceptance. When you are busy resisting reality, you cannot see clearly. Resistance distorts perception. It narrows attention. Acceptance widens it. The nervous system plays a crucial role here. When acceptance is present, the nervous system moves out of survival mode. This creates access to higher cognitive functions like reflection, empathy, and long-term planning. Control keeps the nervous system in threat mode, where only short-term protection matters. This is why acceptance leads to better decisions. A regulated nervous system can hold complexity. It can tolerate uncertainty. It can choose actions that align with values rather than impulses. Acceptance does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop panicking. Panic creates urgency without direction. Acceptance creates space. Space allows choice. There is also a deep compassion embedded in acceptance. When you stop demanding that reality be different, you stop punishing yourself for not controlling it. This reduces shame. Shame is one of the biggest drivers of rigid behavior. Shame says, something is wrong with me because this is happening. Acceptance says, this is happening, and I am still worthy of care. That shift changes everything. When shame loosens, flexibility returns. Flexibility is strength. Rigid systems break. Flexible systems adapt. Acceptance makes the mind flexible. It allows new information. It allows change to occur organically instead of being forced. Many people try to force change before acceptance. They try to fix emotions they have not felt. They try to solve problems they have not fully seen. This creates frustration. Acceptance lays the groundwork for change by revealing what is actually present. When you accept a situation fully, you see it more clearly. You notice details you missed while resisting. You understand dynamics instead of reacting to symptoms. This understanding naturally informs action. Action that arises from acceptance is often quieter. It does not announce itself. It does not need validation. It feels steady rather than urgent. It may even look slower, but it is more effective. Acceptance also protects against burnout. When you accept limits, you stop overextending. You recognize when rest is needed. You respect your capacity. Control ignores limits. Passivity collapses under them. Acceptance works with them. There is a subtle confidence that develops with acceptance. Not confidence that things will go your way, but confidence that you can handle whatever arises. This confidence reduces fear-driven behavior. Acceptance teaches patience, but not complacency. Patience here means allowing processes to unfold without interference. Many things cannot be rushed. Healing, understanding, trust, and growth have their own timing. Forcing them delays them. Wise action respects timing. It knows when to act and when to wait. Waiting is not inaction. It is active presence without interference. Acceptance also improves relationships. Control tries to manage people. Passivity avoids conflict. Acceptance allows others to be who they are without collapsing boundaries. From this place, communication becomes clearer and less defensive. You can accept someone as they are and still choose how close they are to you. Acceptance does not erase discernment, it sharpens it. When you are not trying to change someone, you see them more accurately. This accuracy informs boundaries. Boundaries formed from acceptance are firm without being hostile. They are clear without being rigid. They are respected because they are not reactive. Acceptance also changes how you experience discomfort. Instead of seeing discomfort as a problem to eliminate, you see it as information. Information guides action. Suppressed discomfort creates confusion. When discomfort is allowed, it often reveals unmet needs, misalignment, or fatigue. Responding to these signals prevents larger problems. Control overrides signals. Passivity ignores them. Acceptance listens. Listening is an active process. It requires presence. It requires humility. It requires slowing down enough to hear what is actually happening inside and around you. This slowing down can feel counterintuitive in a world that rewards speed and certainty. But speed without clarity creates mistakes. Certainty without awareness creates rigidity. Acceptance restores balance. True acceptance is courageous. It requires staying present with uncertainty instead of escaping into control or collapse. It requires trusting awareness more than prediction. Over time, acceptance becomes less effortful. It becomes a default posture rather than a technique. You stop asking, "How do I make this go away?" and start asking, "How do I meet this wisely?" That question alone changes the nervous system. It shifts the body out of defense and into engagement. Engagement is where learning happens. Learning is how life evolves. Acceptance is not the end of action. It is the beginning of intelligent action. Action that respects reality rather than fighting it. Action that arises from understanding rather than fear. This is why acceptance feels peaceful without being passive. It allows movement without force. It allows change without violence. It allows life to unfold while staying rooted. As acceptance settles in the body and mind, it becomes clear that strength does not come from control or withdrawal. It comes from alignment with what is actually happening. That alignment is what allows you to move through life with steadiness instead of strain, with clarity instead of urgency, and with purpose instead of pressure. As acceptance becomes more familiar, another layer of tension quietly reveals itself. It doesn't come from resisting what is happening right now. It comes from something more subtle, more persistent. A story about how things were supposed to go. A silent comparison between reality and an imagined version of it. This gap is where a surprising amount of suffering lives. There is a particular kind of pain that lingers long after an event has passed. Not the pain of what happened, but the pain of how different it was from what you expected. The mind replays alternate versions, different choices, different words, different timing, a reality that never existed yet feels painfully real. This is the suffering created by how it should have been. When something difficult happens, the initial pain is often sharp but brief. A loss, a disappointment, a rejection, a mistake. These moments hurt, but they are usually survivable. What extends the pain is not the event itself. It is the mental resistance that follows. The mind says, "This wasn't supposed to happen." That sentence alone can create months or even years of suffering. The human mind is a powerful storyteller. It does not simply register events. It interprets them, frames them, and judges them against expectations. Expectations are not neutral. They are emotional investments in imagined futures. When reality does not match them, the nervous system reacts as if something has gone wrong, even if the situation itself is manageable. Attachment to imagined outcomes feels natural because it gives a sense of direction and meaning. You plan, you hope, you work towards something. But when attachment hardens into certainty, it becomes fragile. Certainty cannot tolerate deviation, and life is full of deviation. This is where suffering multiplies. Not because life is unfair, but because the mind insists on a version of life that never arrived. The phrase, "how it should have been," becomes a lens through which everything is judged. The present moment is no longer enough. It is constantly compared to a mental image. Buddhist teachings explain that suffering arises when the mind clings to concepts rather than meeting direct experience. Should is one of the strongest concepts the mind uses. It implies that reality has failed. It implies a mistake. It implies injustice. These interpretations create emotional reactions that are often more intense than the original event. Notice how the body responds to should. There is tightening, a sense of contraction, a heaviness in the chest or stomach. This is not caused by the event. It is caused by resistance to it. Resistance tells the nervous system that something is wrong and unresolved. The mind often believes that replaying the past will fix it. It thinks that by analyzing, reviewing, and reimagining, it can gain control or closure. But replaying is not processing. It is rehearsing disappointment. Each replay reinforces the emotional charge. This is why people can feel stuck years after an event that objectively ended long ago. The body is still responding to a mental narrative. The nervous system cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. Every time the story is replayed, the stress response is activated again. How it should have been also fuels self-blame. The mind turns inward and says, "If only I had done something differently." This creates a false sense of control over the past. It suggests that the pain exists because of personal failure rather than because life unfolded as it did. Self-blame feels active, but it is another form of resistance. It keeps you tied to the past. It prevents integration. Integration happens when experience is allowed to be complete, not corrected. There is also grief hidden inside should. Grief for the life you thought you would have. Grief for the version of yourself you expected to become. Grief for relationships, opportunities, or identities that did not materialize. This grief often goes unrecognized because it is not tied to something tangible, but it is real. When grief is not acknowledged, it expresses itself as rumination. The mind circles the same thoughts because the emotion beneath them has not been felt. Acceptance allows grief to surface. Resistance keeps it trapped in thought. The idea of should also distorts perception of the present. When you believe something went wrong, you scan for evidence that life is still wrong. This creates a negative bias. Neutral events feel disappointing. Positive moments feel incomplete. The mind cannot fully rest because it is still correcting an imagined error. This creates a chronic sense of dissatisfaction. Even when things improve, the improvement is measured against what was lost. Nothing feels enough. This is not because life is lacking. It is because the measuring stick is imaginary. Letting go of how it should have been does not mean denying that something hurt. It means recognizing that the additional suffering comes from mental attachment, not from the event itself. This recognition is not intellectual, it is embodied. It is felt when the body relaxes after resistance drops. Acceptance here does not mean liking what happened. It means allowing the fact that it happened. Facts cannot be undone by thought. Fighting facts drains energy that could be used for healing. There is often fear underneath the attachment to should. Fear that if you accept what happened, it means it was okay. Fear that acceptance equals approval. But acceptance does not justify harm or loss. It acknowledges reality so that healing can occur. Healing requires contact with what is real, not with alternate timelines, not with imagined corrections. Reality may be painful, but it is workable. Imagined realities are not. The mind clings to imagined outcomes because they feel safer than uncertainty. The past feels fixed. The imagined version feels controllable. The present feels unpredictable. But clinging to the past prevents adaptation to the present. When you release should, something opens. The present moment becomes less burdened. Energy returns. Attention shifts from correcting the past to responding to now. This shift does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, often in small moments. You notice the story starting. You notice the comparison. And instead of following it, you return to sensation, to breathe, to what is actually happening in your body. The body lives in the present. It does not know should. When attention returns to the body, the nervous system exits the loop of imagined suffering. This is why somatic awareness is so important in Buddhist practice. It grounds the mind. How it should have been also affects relationships. Expectations about how others should behave, respond, or change create resentment. When people fail to meet imagined roles, the disappointment lingers. The relationship becomes a negotiation with fantasy instead of an encounter with a real person. Acceptance allows relationships to be seen clearly. Clear seeing does not guarantee harmony, but it prevents unnecessary suffering. When you stop demanding that people be different, you can decide how to engage with them based on who they actually are. This clarity applies inward as well. Many people suffer not because of who they are, but because of who they think they should be. Identity expectations create internal conflict. The present self is constantly judged against an idealized version. This judgment creates tension and shame. Shame is not a motivator, it is a weight. When shame drops, growth becomes more natural. Growth does not require self-rejection, it requires honesty. Letting go of should creates honesty, honest recognition of loss, honest acknowledgement of disappointment, honest acceptance of limitation. This honesty is grounding. It brings the mind back to what is workable. The moment you stop arguing with the past, something settles, not because everything is resolved, but because the internal fight ends. The fight was never with the event, it was with the meaning assigned to it. Meaning can change, facts cannot. When meaning shifts from "this should not have happened" to "this did happen," the nervous system relaxes. That relaxation allows grief to move, understanding to form, and adaptation to occur. This is not resignation, it is realism. Realism is compassionate. It does not add unnecessary suffering to unavoidable pain. It allows life to be complex without turning it into a personal failure. As attachment to imagined outcomes loosens, the present moment becomes less heavy. Attention returns to what is alive now rather than what was lost. This does not erase memory. It changes relationship to memory. Memory becomes information instead of a weapon. It informs without punishing. It teaches without trapping. This is how wisdom forms. When should releases its grip, life does not suddenly become perfect, but it becomes more honest, more spacious, less burdened by comparison. The mind spends less time correcting the past and more time engaging the present. Peace here is not a reward, it is the natural result of no longer fighting what cannot be changed. The energy once used to maintain imagined timelines becomes available for living, and as this understanding settles, the nervous system continues to soften, because it is no longer defending a story. It is responding to life as it is, moment by moment, without the added weight of how it was supposed to be. When the grip on how it should have been finally loosens, something unexpected appears. It is not relief right away, it is not clarity, it is space. And for many people, that space feels unsettling. Without the familiar tension of correcting the past or planning the future, the mind encounters something it has been avoiding all along: stillness. This is often where control rushes back in. There is a reason control feels compulsive. It is not only about managing outcomes or preventing pain, it is also about avoiding emptiness. Not physical emptiness, but inner stillness. The kind of quiet where there is nothing to fix, nothing to analyze, nothing to chase. For a mind trained to stay busy, that quiet can feel threatening. Control addiction is rarely recognized as an addiction because it looks responsible. It looks like planning, organizing, improving, optimizing. It is praised in modern life. But beneath this constant activity is often a deep discomfort with simply being. When there is nothing to manage, the mind feels exposed. Stillness removes distraction. In stillness, unresolved emotions surface. Old fears rise. Unanswered questions echo. Control steps in as a way to stay occupied. It gives the mind a task, so it doesn't have to sit with what feels undefined. This is why letting go of control can feel like losing identity. If you are no longer the one managing everything, who are you? If you stop fixing, planning, and anticipating, what fills the space? These questions are rarely asked consciously, but they shape behavior. The fear of emptiness is not actually fear of nothingness. It is fear of meeting yourself without roles, without strategies, without constant motion. Control creates structure. Emptiness dissolves it. And the ego depends on structure to feel real. In Buddhist understanding, emptiness is often misunderstood. It is not a void. It is not absence. It is openness. It is the recognition that experience is not fixed, not owned, not solid. This openness is freedom, but only after the fear of it is faced. Control addiction keeps the mind in motion. Motion feels safe because it prevents contact with uncertainty. But constant motion also prevents rest. The nervous system never fully settles because it is always preparing for the next task. When control drops, even briefly, the body often responds with discomfort. There may be restlessness, boredom, anxiety, or a sense of purposelessness. These sensations are often misinterpreted as signs that something is wrong. In reality, they are signs that the nervous system is no longer being distracted. The mind has learned to equate activity with safety. Stillness feels like exposure. This is why people often reach for their phones, their plans, their worries the moment things quiet down. Silence becomes intolerable because it brings awareness inward. Control also creates a sense of importance. If you are needed to manage everything, you feel necessary. Emptiness challenges that. In emptiness, nothing needs to be done. No one needs to be managed. The self loses its role. This can feel like loss, but what is being lost is not meaning, it is illusion. The illusion that worth comes from control. The illusion that identity depends on activity. Emptiness strips away these constructions. At first, this feels destabilizing, but what remains is something more stable than identity, awareness itself. Awareness does not need tasks to exist. It does not need validation. It simply is. Control addiction avoids this realization. It keeps the focus outward. It keeps the mind occupied with objects, problems, and goals. But when the objects fall away, awareness remains. This is what Buddhist practice gently points toward. Stillness is not the absence of life. It is the background of it. Life moves through stillness. Thoughts arise and pass. Sensations appear and dissolve. Emotions come and go. Stillness holds them without effort. When control is active, stillness is covered over. The mind does not rest long enough to recognize the space that holds experience. Letting go allows this recognition to emerge. At first, emptiness can feel like boredom. Boredom is often misunderstood. It is not lack of stimulation. It is the discomfort of being without distraction. If you stay with boredom without escaping, it transforms. Under boredom is curiosity. Under curiosity is presence. Presence is not dramatic. It is quiet. It does not entertain. It reveals. This is why control resists it. Presence removes the need for constant doing. There is also fear that without control, life will lose meaning. But meaning created through control is fragile. It depends on outcomes. Meaning that arises from presence is not dependent on success or failure. It is inherent. Emptiness allows meaning to shift from achievement to experience. Instead of asking, "What should I be doing?" the question becomes, "What is here now?" That shift reduces anxiety. Anxiety feeds on imagined futures. Presence feeds on what is real. Control addiction also affects time perception. When you are constantly managing, time feels scarce. There is always not enough. Emptiness expands time. Moments feel fuller because attention is not divided. This expansion can feel uncomfortable at first. Without urgency, the mind feels unanchored. But over time, this spaciousness becomes nourishing. rest stops feeling like a threat. Many people fear emptiness because they associate it with depression or lack of motivation, but emptiness is not numbness. Numbness is shutdown. Emptiness is openness. Numbness avoids feeling. Emptiness allows feeling. Control often masks grief. When activity stops, grief surfaces. This is another reason control is clung to. Grief feels heavy, but grief that is allowed moves. Grief that is avoided stagnates. Emptiness provides the space for grief to be felt without overwhelming the system. In that space, grief can transform into tenderness rather than despair. There is also fear that without control, one will become irresponsible. This fear misunderstands where responsibility comes from. Responsibility rooted in fear is rigid. Responsibility rooted in awareness is responsive. When you are present, you notice what needs attention. You act because something matters, not because you are anxious. This kind of action is more sustainable. It does not require constant pressure. Emptiness does not erase action, it refines it. Actions arise naturally from clarity rather than compulsion. You do what needs to be done, and then you stop. Control never stops. It keeps going even when nothing is required. Control addiction also creates tension in relationships. When you are uncomfortable within a stillness, you may try to manage others to avoid your own discomfort. You focus outward to avoid inward contact. When emptiness is tolerated, relationships soften. You stop needing others to fill internal gaps. You stop controlling their behavior to regulate your emotions. This creates more genuine connection. Stillness also reveals the impermanent nature of experience. Thoughts pass, emotions shift, sensations change. Control tries to freeze experience. Emptiness allows it to flow. This flow is what freedom feels like. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from compulsion. Freedom from the need to constantly define, fix, or justify yourself. Buddhist teachings emphasize that emptiness is not something to achieve. It is something to recognize. It is already present beneath the noise. Control keeps the noise loud. Letting go reveals what was always there. The fear of emptiness fades with familiarity. As you spend time without filling space, the nervous system learns that stillness is safe. The urge to control weakens, not through force, but through trust. Trust develops when you see that nothing collapses when you stop managing everything. Life continues, breath continues, awareness continues, you are still here. This realization is deeply stabilizing. It removes the urgency that fuels control addiction. You no longer need to prove your existence through activity. Emptiness becomes restful rather than threatening. It becomes a refuge rather than a void. In that refuge, clarity grows, compassion deepens, action becomes simpler. Control once promised safety and meaning. Emptiness delivers something quieter and more durable. Freedom from the need to constantly become something else. And in that freedom, life feels less like a problem to solve and more like a reality to participate in, without force, without avoidance, with presence that does not need to be filled. As inner stillness becomes less frightening and more familiar, attention naturally shifts outward again, not to control life but to relate to it. And this is where one of the most delicate forms of control reveals itself, not the kind that plans outcomes or manages emotions, but the kind that quietly tries to reshape other people, often with good intentions, often in the name of love, growth, or wisdom. There is a particular discomfort that arises when you see someone you care about suffering in ways that seem unnecessary. You notice their patterns, you see their blind spots. You sense what they could become if only they understood what you understand. This discomfort is real. It comes from care. But what you do with it matters more than the feeling itself. The urge to help others change is deeply human. It feels compassionate. It feels responsible. It feels like engagement rather than indifference. But beneath this urge, there is often an unexamined assumption that you know what someone else needs better than they do. This assumption is where subtle violence begins. Violence does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like pressure. Sometimes it looks like persuasion. Sometimes it looks like constant advice, correction, or concern. When you try to awaken someone before they are ready, you are not meeting them where they are. You are trying to pull them into a version of reality that makes you more comfortable. This kind of control is especially tempting when you have done inner work yourself. Insight can create distance. Awareness can create impatience. You forget how long it took you to see what you now see. You forget the resistance you once had. You forget that understanding cannot be transferred like information. Awakening is not a concept someone adopts. It is a process that unfolds when conditions are right. No amount of explanation can replace lived experience. When you try to force insight, you bypass the path that makes insight real. Buddhist ethics emphasize non-interference, not because people should not care, but because genuine care respects autonomy. Every being has their own timing, their own lessons, their own way of meeting suffering. Interfering with that process, even gently, can disrupt something essential. Trying to change others often comes from discomfort with helplessness. You want to relieve their pain, but you also want to relieve your own discomfort at witnessing it. Control disguises itself as compassion when you cannot tolerate the limits of your influence. There is also ego hidden in the desire to awaken others. The ego enjoys being right. It enjoys being ahead. It enjoys being the one who sees. When you try to lead others toward insight, you may unconsciously reinforce a sense of superiority. This creates separation, not connection. People do not awaken through pressure. Pressure creates defensiveness. Defensiveness hardens identity. When identity hardens, insight becomes less likely. Advice offered too early is often heard as judgment, even if none was intended. Non-interference does not mean silence in all cases. It means discernment. It means recognizing when your words are an offering and when they are an intrusion. It means asking whether you are responding to a request or imposing a vision. In Buddhist practice, right speech is not only about truth, it is about timing, intention, and impact. A true statement delivered at the wrong time can cause harm. Wisdom knows when to speak and when to stay present without fixing. Presence is often more transformative than instruction. When you embody calm, clarity, and compassion, others feel it. They may not name it. They may not immediately respond to it, but it registers. It creates safety. Safety is what allows people to question their patterns. Trying to awaken someone often creates the opposite effect. They feel seen as a problem. They feel inadequate. They feel pressured to change for your comfort. This creates resistance. Resistance is not stubbornness. It is self-protection. Every person has a protective structure built from their experiences. That structure may look limiting from the outside, but it once served a purpose. Dismantling it too quickly can feel threatening. Awakening that bypasses safety becomes destabilizing. This is why Buddhist ethics emphasize compassion before insight. Compassion does not rush, it does not correct. It stays close without controlling. It allows others to feel met rather than managed. When you release control over others' awakening, relationships change, conversations soften, listening deepens. You stop waiting for someone to get it and start meeting them where they are. This creates trust. Trust is fertile ground for growth. Without trust, insight becomes defensive. With trust, curiosity emerges naturally. Curiosity opens doors that advice cannot. Releasing control also means releasing the fantasy of being responsible for others' lives. Responsibility is often confused with obligation. You can care deeply without carrying another person's evolution on your shoulders. Carrying others' awakening is heavy. It creates frustration. You watch them repeat patterns. You feel stuck. You feel unheard. This frustration is a sign that a boundary has been crossed internally. You have taken on a role that was never yours. When you step back, something unexpected happens. Your energy returns. You stop burning yourself out trying to move others. You become more available emotionally because you are not pushing. This availability is felt. People relax around you. They sense that you are not trying to change them. In that relaxation, deeper conversations may arise organically, or they may not. Either outcome is respected. Non-interference also protects you from resentment. When you invest in changing others, you create expectations. When those expectations are not met, resentment builds. Resentment poisons compassion. Letting others be who they are frees you from monitoring their progress. It allows you to focus on your own practice. And your own practice is the most powerful influence you have. People learn less from what you say and more from how you live. If your presence is grounded, open, and non-reactive, it speaks quietly but clearly. That kind of teaching does not intrude. It invites. This does not mean withholding help when it is asked for. When someone genuinely seeks guidance, offering it with humility and without attachment to outcome can be skillful. The key difference is consent. Guidance offered without request is often experienced as control. Consent creates mutual respect. It ensures that help is received rather than defended against. It aligns intention with readiness. Releasing control over others' awakening also requires trust in life. Trust that people are learning what they need to learn, even when it looks messy. Trust that suffering, while painful, is not meaningless. It often carries the seeds of insight. This trust does not make you indifferent. It makes you patient. Patience is not passive. It is active faith in the unfolding process. There is also humility in non-interference. You acknowledge that your perspective is partial. You accept that what looks like stagnation from the outside may be integration on the inside. Growth is not always visible. When you stop trying to direct others' paths, you stop comparing timelines. Comparison creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates distance. Distance reduces compassion. Equality restores it. Equality does not mean sameness. It means recognizing that everyone is navigating conditions you cannot fully see. Non-interference is not withdrawal. It is engagement without manipulation. It is care without agenda. It is love without control. This approach also protects the dignity of others. Awakening that arises from dignity is stable. Awakening that arises from shame is fragile. By releasing the need to awaken others, you allow relationships to be real rather than instructional. Real relationships are unpredictable. They challenge you. They reveal your own attachments. Often the urge to change others points to something unresolved in yourself. Their behavior triggers discomfort. You want them to change so you don't have to feel something. This realization can be humbling. When you turn attention back inward, you may discover that what you wanted them to see is something you are still learning to live. This deepens your practice. Releasing control over others' awakening is not a loss. It is a refinement of compassion. It moves compassion from action-driven to presence-based. Presence-based compassion does not collapse under frustration. It does not demand results. It remains steady even when nothing changes. This steadiness is rare. It is felt immediately. It creates a different quality of connection. A connection where people feel free rather than evaluated. Freedom is the soil in which awakening grows. Not pressure, not persuasion, not insistence. When you stop trying to move others, you begin to walk more honestly yourself. And that honesty becomes the quiet influence you were searching for all along. When the need to shape other people's inner journeys finally loosens, another pattern becomes easier to see. Control does not stop at beliefs or emotions. It shows up in daily behavior, in small corrections, in constant oversight, in the urge to manage details that do not truly belong to you. This is where control becomes habitual, almost invisible, and where its consequences quietly accumulate over time. Micromanagement is often justified as care. It presents itself as responsibility, efficiency, or high standards. But beneath it lies the same fear that has followed every form of control so far. Fear that without constant supervision, things will fall apart. This fear rarely announces itself openly. Instead, it disguises itself as vigilance. The word karma is often misunderstood as punishment. In Buddhist understanding, karma is not a moral sentence handed down by the universe. It is cause and effect. Action leaves an imprint. Intention shapes outcome. What you repeatedly do trains the mind, conditions relationships, and influences the future. Micromanagement plants seeds, not dramatic ones, small, repeated ones. A correction here, a reminder there, a decision made for someone else just to be safe. Each act may seem harmless. Together they shape patterns that eventually produce suffering. In relationships, micromanagement erodes trust. When you constantly oversee, adjust, or improve someone's actions, you send a subtle message. I don't believe you can handle this. Even when spoken kindly, this message is felt. Over time, the other person may begin to doubt themselves. Self-doubt is not created through failure alone. It is often created through constant interference. When someone is not allowed to try, struggle, and learn, their confidence weakens. This is one of the hidden costs of control. You believe you are helping, but you are removing opportunities for growth. This dynamic affects not only others, but you as well. When you take responsibility for everything, you train yourself to believe that nothing functions without you. This belief becomes heavy. It creates pressure. You become indispensable but also exhausted. Excessive control narrows your life. Your attention is always outward, scanning for errors, fixing problems, preventing mistakes. There is little space for rest, little room for curiosity, little trust in flow. In work environments, micromanagement stifles creativity. People stop offering ideas. They stop taking initiative. Why risk being corrected or overridden? Over time, they disengage. Productivity may appear stable for a while, but innovation declines. Micromanagement also creates dependency. When people are not trusted to make decisions, they stop trying. They wait for instructions. This reinforces the controller's belief that they must stay in charge, creating a cycle that feeds itself. This cycle produces karma, not as punishment, but as consequence. The more you control, the more responsibility you carry. The more responsibility you carry, the more overwhelmed you become. Overwhelm increases fear. Fear increases control. In personal relationships, micromanagement often shows up as advice that was not asked for, reminders that feel like criticism, or concern that feels intrusive. Over time, intimacy suffers. People begin to withhold. Conversations become guarded. The controller may feel lonely without understanding why. They are surrounded by people, yet connection feels shallow. This loneliness is not caused by others pulling away. It is caused by the invisible barrier control creates. Control prevents mutual vulnerability. When you are always in the role of manager, you are rarely fully present as a participant. You are watching, evaluating, adjusting. Presence requires letting go of the need to oversee. There is also karma within the mind itself. Micromanagement trains the mind to distrust spontaneity. It creates a belief that things only go well when they are tightly controlled. This belief follows you inward. You begin to micromanage your own thoughts, your emotions, your healing, your progress. Nothing is allowed to unfold naturally. Everything must be monitored. This creates internal tension. Self-trust erodes when you do not allow yourself to respond naturally. You second-guess instincts. You overthink decisions. You rehearse outcomes. The inner world becomes as managed as the outer one. This is the karmic effect of micromanagement. A mind that cannot relax, a body that cannot rest, relationships that cannot breathe. None of this happens suddenly. It unfolds gradually through repetition. Micromanagement also limits learning. Mistakes are teachers. When mistakes are prevented at all costs, learning is delayed. You may avoid short-term discomfort, but you create long-term stagnation. There is often a fear of chaos beneath micromanagement. Chaos is imagined as failure, embarrassment, or loss of control. But most chaos feared is simply variability. Variability is natural. Life is adaptive, not linear. When you try to eliminate variability, you eliminate resilience. Resilience grows from responding to change, not from preventing it. Micromanagement reduces resilience by removing the opportunity to adapt. This applies to yourself as well. When you control your inner experience too tightly, you reduce emotional flexibility. You become afraid of strong feelings because you are not practiced at allowing them to move. The karmic result is increased anxiety. Anxiety thrives on hyper-control. It feeds on the belief that one wrong move will cause collapse. Letting go in small ways retrains the nervous system. Micromanagement also affects how you experience time. Everything feels urgent. There is always something that needs adjustment. This creates chronic stress. Stress narrows perception. Narrow perception increases control. Breaking this cycle requires seeing micromanagement clearly, without judgment. Judgment itself is another form of control. Clarity is different. Clarity sees cause and effect without self-attack. When you notice the urge to micromanage, pause. Ask what fear is underneath. Fear of failure, fear of being blamed, fear of being unnecessary. These fears are human. Seeing them reduces their power. Releasing micromanagement does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means shifting from dominance to trust. Trust does not mean blind faith. It means allowing others and yourself to engage with reality directly. Trust allows mistakes. It allows learning. It allows shared responsibility. Shared responsibility reduces burnout. It creates cooperation rather than hierarchy. In work, this means giving clear expectations and then stepping back. In relationships, it means expressing needs without managing outcomes. Internally, it means setting intentions without controlling every step. Letting go of micromanagement can feel risky at first. There may be discomfort watching things unfold without interference. This discomfort is the nervous system adjusting to a new pattern. Over time, something shifts. You notice that many things work out without your constant involvement. You notice that people rise when trusted. You notice that your own mind becomes quieter. This quiet is not emptiness in the frightening sense. It is relief. Relief from carrying what was never meant to be carried alone. Karma unfolds here as well. Different actions create different results. When control softens, trust grows. When trust grows, connection deepens. When connection deepens, life feels more supportive. Self-trust returns when you allow yourself to respond rather than manage. You learn through experience that you can handle uncertainty. Each moment of allowance builds confidence. Micromanagement once felt necessary. It felt like protection. But its long-term effects reveal a different truth. What protects in the short term can harm in the long term. Seeing this does not require guilt. It requires awareness. Awareness allows choice. Choice allows change. As micromanagement releases its hold, something steadier replaces it. Not passivity, not carelessness, but a grounded presence that knows when to act and when to allow. This presence does not need to control every detail to feel safe. It understands that life is cooperative, not something to be dominated. In this understanding, the seeds of suffering are no longer planted. Different seeds take their place. Seeds of trust, seeds of balance, seeds of a future that feels lighter because it is no longer built on constant control. As the habit of micromanagement loosens, something deeper begins to surface. It is no longer just about trusting others or releasing daily control. It is about facing a truth that control was quietly trying to deny all along. A truth so simple yet so unsettling that the mind has spent years looking away from it. Nothing stays, nothing can be held, and this truth changes everything. There is a quiet discomfort that arises when you truly slow down and look at life without filters. Not fear exactly, more like a soft ache, the kind that comes from realizing how much effort has gone into holding things still. Roles, relationships, bodies, moments, identities. The mind clings because it believes stability comes from permanence. Impermanence threatens that belief. Impermanence is not an abstract idea. It is not philosophy meant for monasteries or books. It is the most intimate fact of living. Every breath begins and ends. Every emotion rises and falls. Every situation shifts, whether welcomed or resisted. Control survives by pretending this is not true. From early on, the mind learns to attach. Attachment creates a sense of continuity. If I hold on to this, I remain safe. If I preserve this moment, this person, this version of myself, then I exist in something solid. Impermanence shatters this illusion gently but relentlessly. The fear is not of change itself. The fear is of what change exposes. That nothing is owned, that nothing is guaranteed, that security built on holding is unstable by nature. This realization can feel destabilizing, especially for a mind trained to seek certainty. Yet impermanence is not cruel, it is honest. It does not take things away out of malice. It simply reveals what was always true, that everything you experience is moving. Trying to stop it does not preserve it. It only adds tension. When you deeply contemplate impermanence, control begins to look unnecessary, even futile. You start to see that no amount of planning can freeze time, no vigilance can prevent aging, no strategy can guarantee permanence in relationships, health, success, or identity. This realization often triggers grief. Not dramatic grief, but subtle mourning. Grief for illusions, grief for expectations, grief for the fantasy that something could finally be secure if managed well enough. This grief is not a problem, it is a release. Impermanence teaches surrender not through force, but through repetition. You see things change again and again. At first the mind resists, then it bargains. Eventually, something softens. Resistance gives way to understanding. Surrender here does not mean collapse. It means alignment with reality. It means recognizing that holding tightly does not prevent loss. It only increases suffering when loss inevitably arrives. There is a common misunderstanding that contemplating impermanence leads to detachment or indifference. In truth, it does the opposite. When you accept that nothing lasts, appreciation deepens. Moments become precious because they are fleeting. Impermanence sharpens attention. When you know a moment will not return, you are more likely to be present. Control pulls you out of presence by trying to extend or preserve. Surrender brings you into contact with what is here now. The body understands impermanence instinctively. Sensations arise and fade without commentary. Pain shifts. Pleasure dissolves. The mind adds stories, trying to make sense of these changes. Often, those stories create more suffering than the sensations themselves. When you sit with impermanence, you notice how much of suffering comes from wishing something would stay the same. You want happiness to last, pain to end, people to remain unchanged. Life refuses these demands. This refusal is not punishment, it is instruction. Impermanence teaches flexibility, it teaches adaptability, it teaches humility. You are not in charge of time, you are part of it. Contemplating impermanence dismantles the illusion of possession. You begin to see that people are not owned, experiences are not stored, even the body is not permanent property. This can feel unsettling, but it is also freeing. If nothing can be held, then nothing can truly be lost in the way the ego fears. Loss still hurts, but it is no longer personal failure. It is participation in the nature of things. Impermanence also dissolves rigid identity. The person you were 10 years ago is gone. The person you will be in 10 years does not yet exist. Holding on to a fixed self creates conflict. You try to preserve an image that reality keeps reshaping. Surrendering to impermanence allows identity to become fluid. You respond to life as it unfolds, instead of defending a version of yourself that no longer fits. This fluidity reduces anxiety. You stop measuring yourself against outdated standards. Control often emerges when impermanence feels threatening. You try to control health when the body changes. You try to control relationships when people evolve. You try to control outcomes when circumstances shift. Impermanence exposes the limits of these strategies. The more you resist impermanence, the more exhausted you become. You are swimming against a current that never stops. Surrender does not mean drifting aimlessly. It means swimming with awareness instead of resistance. Buddhist practice often returns again and again to impermanence because it cuts through illusion quickly. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply shows what is already happening. When you truly see impermanence, priorities shift. You spend less time trying to secure the future and more time tending to the present. You become less attached to results and more attentive to process. Impermanence also deepens compassion when you recognize that everyone is navigating change, loss, and uncertainty. Judgment softens. Harshness gives way to understanding. You see that control in others is often fear, not malice. This understanding reduces conflict. You stop taking change personally. You stop interpreting loss as betrayal. You see life as movement rather than opposition. There is also relief in impermanence. If nothing can be held, then failure is not final. Mistakes do not define you forever. Pain does not last indefinitely. This perspective brings balance. Control demands certainty. Impermanence offers honesty. Honesty is less comfortable at first, but more stable in the long run. It does not collapse when circumstances change. Surrender to impermanence also changes how you relate to effort. You still act, you still care, but you act without the illusion of permanence. You plant seeds knowing you may not see the harvest. This removes pressure. This kind of effort is lighter. It is not driven by fear of loss. It is guided by values rather than attachment. You do what feels right now without demanding it last forever. Impermanence also teaches you to let experiences complete themselves. You stop clinging to pleasure. You stop resisting pain. You allow both to move through. This reduces emotional turbulence. When you stop trying to freeze experience, emotions flow more naturally. They rise and fall without becoming identities. This is emotional freedom, not emotional suppression. Surrender here is not dramatic. It is quiet. It shows up as less mental commentary, less why me, less this shouldn't change. The mind becomes less argumentative. Impermanence humbles the ego. The ego wants control because it wants continuity. It wants to remain. Impermanence shows that continuity exists without ego's effort. Life continues whether the ego tightens or relaxes. This realization does not erase fear completely. Fear may still arise, but fear is no longer in charge. It becomes another impermanent experience, noticed and allowed. Over time, surrender becomes less of an act and more of a posture. You stop bracing against change. You meet it with curiosity, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with gratitude, always with honesty. Impermanence does not remove pain, but it removes surprise. When change happens, you are not shocked. You are not betrayed by reality. You recognize it as the nature of things. This recognition reduces suffering. Suffering often comes from expecting permanence in an impermanent world. When expectation aligns with reality, tension dissolves. Impermanence also changes how you experience joy. Joy is no longer something to trap or preserve. It is something to savor. You enjoy it fully because you are not afraid of losing it. Fear of loss often prevents full enjoyment. You hold back because you know it will end. Impermanence invites the opposite response. Because it will end, you show up. This presence is what makes life feel rich, even when it is difficult. Richness does not come from permanence. It comes from contact. Surrendering to impermanence restores trust. Not trust that things will stay the same, but trust that you can meet change without breaking. This trust is deeper than control. Control promises safety through rigidity. Impermanence delivers stability through flexibility. Flexible systems survive change, rigid systems fracture. As impermanence becomes a lived understanding rather than an idea, the need to hold loosens naturally. The hands open, the breath deepens, the mind rests more easily. You stop demanding guarantees. You stop negotiating with time. You participate instead of resist. This is the quiet power of impermanence. It does not need to convince, it simply reveals. And in that revelation, surrender stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like alignment with how life has always been. As the truth of impermanence settles more deeply, another struggle quietly comes into view. Even when you accept that life changes, even when you stop gripping people, outcomes, and identities, there is often one place where control holds on the longest: pain, especially your own. The desire to heal quickly, cleanly, and permanently becomes the next battleground. There is a subtle urgency that appears around healing, a pressure to move on, a need to be better already, a belief that pain is a problem to solve rather than an experience to be lived through. This urgency does not come from wisdom, it comes from discomfort with being unfinished. Many people approach healing the same way they approach control. They set timelines, they measure progress, they judge setbacks, they search for techniques to eliminate pain rather than understand it. Healing becomes another task to complete, another identity to achieve. But healing does not respond to force. Pain does not dissolve under pressure. In fact, pressure is one of the main reasons pain lingers. When you try to push healing forward, you communicate to the nervous system that something is wrong right now. That signal keeps the system activated. Pain is not only a sensation, it is information. Emotional pain carries messages about loss, violation, unmet needs, and boundaries crossed. Spiritual pain often signals disconnection, confusion, or identity collapse. When you rush to heal, you interrupt the message before it is fully received. Forcing healing is often a form of avoidance. It looks productive, but it is driven by fear of staying with discomfort. You want relief, not relationship. You want resolution, not understanding. But understanding is what transforms pain. The body heals in cycles. Emotional systems heal through expression, integration, and time. There is no shortcut through these processes. Attempts to bypass them may reduce awareness temporarily, but they rarely resolve the root. Many people believe that if they truly accept pain, it will overwhelm them. This fear keeps pain at a distance, but pain that is resisted becomes sharper. Pain that is allowed becomes dynamic. It moves. Allowing pain does not mean indulging it or identifying with it. It means giving it space without interference. This space is what allows pain to change form. Without space, pain stays fixed. Control over healing often comes from comparison. You see others who seem healed. You measure yourself against timelines. You wonder why you are still struggling. Comparison turns healing into performance. Performance blocks vulnerability. Healing requires honesty. Honesty about how much something hurt. Honesty about what was lost. Honesty about anger, sadness, fear, and confusion. Control censors this honesty because some feelings feel unacceptable. Spiritual healing is especially prone to control. People use concepts, practices, and beliefs to avoid feeling pain. They try to rise above suffering instead of staying present with it. This creates a split between spiritual identity and emotional reality. This split delays healing. What is denied does not integrate. It waits. Often it shows up later as numbness, bitterness, or sudden emotional collapse. True healing is not linear. It does not move steadily forward. It spirals. Old pain resurfaces in new forms. This does not mean healing failed. It means deeper layers are ready to be felt. Control interprets resurfacing pain as regression. Allowance understands it as progression. When you stop judging pain, you stop adding a second layer of suffering. There is also fear that if you let pain exist, it will define you. But pain only defines you when it is avoided. When pain is allowed, it becomes part of your experience, not your identity. Allowing pain requires trust in your capacity to feel without breaking. This trust is often missing because past pain may have been overwhelming, but you are not the same nervous system you were then. Capacity changes. Healing happens when pain is felt in manageable doses, within a sense of safety. Control disrupts this by either suppressing pain or flooding the system with forced exposure. Allowance allows pacing. Pacing is crucial. Healing is not about diving into pain endlessly. It is about touching it, resting, and returning. This rhythm allows integration. Control ignores rhythm. It demands results. Pain also transforms when it is witnessed without judgment. Judgment tightens pain. Compassion softens it. Compassion does not mean liking pain. It means acknowledging its presence without adding blame. Blame is another way control sneaks into healing. You blame yourself for not healing faster. You blame others for causing the pain. Blame creates stagnation. It keeps the story alive. Allowing pain does not require understanding why it exists. Many people wait for insight before allowing feeling, but feeling often comes first. Insight follows. The body processes pain through sensation, tightness, heat, heaviness, shaking, tears. When these sensations are allowed to move, the nervous system completes stress responses that were interrupted in the past. Control interrupts these processes. It tells the body to stop, to calm down, to be reasonable. But the body does not respond to reason. It responds to permission. Permission is powerful. When you allow yourself to feel without agenda, the body releases what it has been holding. This release is not dramatic, it is subtle. A sigh, a softening, a sense of space. Spiritual healing also deepens when control is released. You stop trying to become someone healed. You stop chasing states of peace. You allow confusion, doubt, and not knowing. Not knowing is often part of spiritual healing. Old beliefs fall away before new understanding forms. Control tries to fill the gap quickly. Allowance stays with uncertainty. This uncertainty can feel like emptiness. But as seen earlier, emptiness is not absence. It is openness. In healing, openness allows new meaning to arise organically rather than being imposed. Healing also involves grief. Grief for what was lost. Grief for who you were. Grief for what will never be. Control avoids grief by rushing forward. Allowance lets grief complete its cycle. Grief that is allowed transforms into tenderness. Grief that is avoided hardens into bitterness or despair. Tenderness reconnects you to life. Bitterness separates you from it. Letting go of control over healing also means releasing the need for closure. Some wounds do not resolve neatly. Some losses do not make sense. Healing does not require answers. It requires presence. Presence with pain builds resilience. Each time you allow pain without trying to escape, you teach your system that pain is survivable. This reduces fear. Reduced fear allows deeper healing. Healing is not about becoming pain-free. It is about becoming less afraid of pain. When fear decreases, pain loses its grip. Control also isolates healing. You feel like you should handle it alone. Allowance opens the door to support. Support does not heal you, but it provides safety for healing to occur. Healing is relational. Even inner healing happens in the context of connection, whether with another person, with your body, or with awareness itself. Control tries to manage healing in isolation. Allowance invites relationship. This invitation does not mean oversharing or dependency. It means letting yourself be seen where it feels safe. Being seen without judgment is deeply regulating. Letting go of control over healing also changes how you view time. You stop asking how long it will take. You stop setting deadlines for feeling better. This removes pressure. Pressure delays healing. It keeps the nervous system vigilant. Vigilance prevents integration. When pressure drops, the system can process. Healing often happens in quiet moments. Moments when you are not trying, when you are resting, when attention softens. Control rarely allows these moments. By allowing healing to unfold, you align with the body's intelligence. The body knows how to heal when not interfered with. This applies emotionally and spiritually as well. There may be moments when pain intensifies after you stop controlling it. This is not a sign of failure. It is often a sign that something long held is finally allowed to surface. Allowing does not mean drowning. It means staying present while sensations move. Grounding in breath, body, or environment provides stability. Healing transforms pain not by erasing it, but by integrating it. Integrated pain becomes wisdom. It informs boundaries. It deepens empathy. It clarifies values. Control tries to eliminate pain to return to who you were. Allowance allows pain to change who you are. This change is often what healing actually is. You may never return to the person you were before pain. This is not a loss. It is evolution. Control resists evolution. Allowance welcomes it. As healing unfolds without force, you begin to trust the process. Trust replaces urgency. Patience replaces pressure. Curiosity replaces judgment. This trust does not mean passivity. It means cooperation with your own nature. You listen, you respond, you rest, you engage when needed. Healing becomes less about fixing and more about relating. Relating to pain with honesty. Relating to yourself with kindness. Relating to life with openness. In this relationship, pain no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a messenger, and when the message is received, pain often changes on its own. Letting go of control over healing does not remove difficulty. It removes the fight with difficulty. That fight was never healing you. It was keeping you stuck. When you stop forcing healing, healing begins to move. Quietly, unpredictably, gently, at its own pace. And in allowing pain rather than managing it, you discover something unexpected. Pain does not destroy you when met with presence. It transforms you. As pain is allowed instead of forced away, another truth quietly surfaces. Not all control comes from fear of the future. Some of it comes from the past, from losses that were never fully felt, from goodbyes that were rushed, from moments where survival demanded strength instead of sorrow. Control steps in where grief was not given space. There is a particular heaviness that comes from loss that was never processed. It does not always show up as sadness. Often, it disguises itself. It becomes rigidity. It becomes the need for certainty. It becomes planning everything in advance, so nothing unexpected can hurt again. This is how control becomes a mask for grief. Grief is not only about death, it is about endings. The end of relationships, the end of dreams, the end of safety, the end of who you thought you would be. When these endings happen too quickly or too often, the nervous system may not have the capacity to feel them fully. So it adapts. That adaptation often looks like control. If you can prevent loss from happening again, you won't have to feel what you couldn't feel before. If you can anticipate every outcome, nothing will catch you off guard. If you can stay prepared, you won't be vulnerable. This strategy makes sense. It is protective. But it comes at a cost. Unmet grief does not disappear. It goes underground. It shapes behavior from the shadows. It tightens the body. It sharpens the mind. It creates a constant sense of vigilance. The person may not even know what they are guarding against. They just know they cannot relax. Control gives grief something to do. It turns sorrow into action. Instead of feeling loss, you organize, you plan, you manage, you become efficient. Efficiency is praised, grief is not. So control feels acceptable, grief feels dangerous. Many people learned early that grief was not welcome. There was no time, no space, no permission. They learned to stay strong. Strength became identity, control became survival, vulnerability became risk. This is why rigidity often increases after loss. The nervous system associates openness with danger. It closes ranks. It creates rules. It demands predictability. Any deviation feels threatening because it echoes past pain. Planning becomes compulsive when grief is unresolved. Not because planning is bad, but because it is driven by fear. The future is mapped not out of creativity, but out of anxiety. Spontaneity feels unsafe. Uncertainty feels like loss repeating itself. Compulsive certainty is another expression of grief avoidance. When you insist on knowing, on clarity, on guarantees, you are trying to prevent the shock of loss. But life does not offer guarantees. The mind keeps demanding them anyway. This demand creates tension. Tension that lives in the jaw, the shoulders, the gut. The body stays braced. Rest feels unfamiliar. Letting go feels irresponsible. This is grief speaking through control. Grief also expresses itself as intolerance, intolerance of mistakes, intolerance of ambiguity, intolerance of others' unpredictability. These are not personality flaws. They are signs of a system that learned loss was unbearable. Unmet grief often creates impatience with others' emotions. When someone expresses sadness or confusion, it can trigger discomfort. Not because you lack empathy, but because their feelings touch something unprocessed in you. Control steps in to shut this down. Advice replaces listening. Fixing replaces presence. Certainty replaces compassion. This protects you from feeling, but it also blocks connection. Grief needs witnessing. When it is not witnessed, it looks for other outlets. Control is one of the most socially acceptable outlets. It earns praise, it looks competent, it hides vulnerability. But the cost is subtle and ongoing. Relationships feel tense, joy feels fragile. Relaxation feels earned rather than natural. There is always something to manage, something to prepare for, something to fix. Grief also affects how you relate to time. You may rush because you fear running out, or you may freeze because moving forward feels like betrayal of what was lost. Control oscillates between these extremes. Unresolved loss often creates a fear of repetition. You try to ensure that nothing similar ever happens again. But this fear limits life. You avoid risks. You avoid attachment. You avoid depth. Depth reminds you of loss. Control promises protection, but it also isolates. You may feel alone even when surrounded by people. Grief wants connection. Control blocks it. The mind often believes that if grief is allowed, it will overwhelm everything. This belief keeps grief contained. But grief, like pain, moves when allowed. It does not destroy, it softens. Allowing grief requires safety. Safety comes from slowing down, from presence, from compassion. Control creates busyness. Busyness avoids grief. When grief is finally given space, it often surprises people. It may not look how they expected. It may come in waves. It may come quietly. It may come as fatigue rather than tears. All of this is normal. Grief does not follow rules. It does not follow timelines. Control tries to impose structure on it. Allowance lets it unfold. Unmet grief also affects self-trust. You may not trust yourself to handle loss again, so you try to prevent it. This creates a belief that you are fragile. But this belief comes from not having experienced yourself surviving grief fully. When grief is allowed and integrated, self-trust grows. You learn that loss hurts, but it does not end you. This knowledge reduces the need for control. Grief also clarifies values. What you grieve points to what mattered. Control obscures this clarity by focusing on prevention rather than meaning. There is wisdom in grief. It deepens compassion. It refines priorities. It humanizes. Control sterilizes experience. Grief makes it real. Many people fear that if they stop controlling, grief will flood in. Sometimes it does, briefly. But floods recede. They leave the ground richer. Controlled ground stays dry but barren. Allowing grief does not mean dwelling in it. It means letting it complete its cycle. Suppressed grief repeats. Allowed grief transforms. Grief also needs ritual. Not necessarily formal rituals, but moments of acknowledgement, moments where loss is named, where tears are allowed, where memories are honored. Control often skips these moments. When grief is named, it becomes less heavy. When it is hidden, it grows weight. Control adds layers to this weight. There is also collective grief that goes unrecognized. Loss of safety, loss of innocence, loss of community. These losses shape behavior at a societal level. Control becomes normalized, rigidity becomes policy, certainty becomes ideology. On an individual level, noticing where control tightens can point you toward unacknowledged grief. Instead of asking, "How do I stop controlling?" a gentler question is, "What loss am I protecting myself from feeling?" This question opens space, space for honesty, space for compassion, space for healing. Grief often needs gentleness, not solutions. It needs time, not timelines. It needs presence, not plans. When grief is met with acceptance, control softens naturally. There is less to defend against, less to manage, less to prevent. Rigidity loosens when sorrow is allowed to breathe. Planning becomes flexible when fear of loss diminishes. Certainty becomes curiosity when trust returns. Grief also reconnects you to others. Shared grief creates bonds. It reminds you that vulnerability is universal. Control isolates. Grief connects. This connection does not erase pain. It makes it bearable. It reminds you that you are not alone in loss. When grief is no longer hidden, life feels less brittle. You are less afraid of change, less afraid of endings, less afraid of feeling deeply. Control once felt like protection, but protection built on avoidance is fragile. Grief-integrated living is resilient. Resilience does not mean you won't be hurt again. It means you trust yourself to feel and recover. This trust reduces the need to armor up. As grief is allowed, something unexpected happens. Softness returns. Not weakness, softness, a willingness to be touched by life again. This softness allows joy to enter more fully. Joy and grief are not opposites, they coexist. Control blocks both. Unmet grief kept control alive. Met grief lets control rest. When grief is given space, rigidity loses its purpose. Planning becomes a tool, not a shield. Certainty becomes preference, not necessity. And in this shift, life feels more honest, more spacious, less managed, more lived. Grief does not ask you to collapse. It asks you to feel. And when you do, the need to control slowly releases its grip, not because you forced it, but because it is no longer needed. As grief is finally allowed to surface instead of being masked by rigidity, another pattern becomes visible. Control is no longer only about managing life or avoiding loss. Sometimes it turns inward. It becomes a way of managing yourself, your thoughts, your behavior, your body. And when this inner control is driven by shame, it quietly becomes a form of violence. There is a kind of discipline that looks admirable from the outside. It appears as self-control, restraint, high standards, and constant self-improvement. But beneath it, there is often a harsh voice that says, "You are not enough as you are." This voice does not motivate through encouragement. It motivates through fear. Shame-based self-control is not about growth. It is about correction. It assumes there is something fundamentally wrong that must be fixed, suppressed, or overcome. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every slip becomes a verdict. The body becomes an object to manage rather than a living system to care for. This form of control often begins early. Many people learned that love, safety, or belonging depended on performance. They were rewarded for being good, quiet, strong, or successful. Over time, this external pressure became internalized. The watcher moved inside. Self-control rooted in shame does not rest. It is always monitoring, always evaluating, always comparing who you are to who you think you should be. This constant surveillance creates tension. The nervous system stays activated because it is never allowed to relax into acceptance. Violence does not always involve force. Sometimes it involves denial, denial of rest, denial of softness, denial of emotion. When you push yourself beyond limits while ignoring signals of exhaustion or pain, that is a form of self-directed harm. Shame-based discipline often praises suffering. You believe that if something is hard, it must be good. If you are exhausted, you must be doing something right. This belief disconnects effort from wisdom. It glorifies strain. There is a difference between commitment and punishment. Commitment arises from care. Punishment arises from rejection. When you discipline yourself because you believe you are broken, the discipline itself reinforces that belief. The body feels this difference immediately. Compassionate discipline creates steadiness. Shame-based control creates tightness. One builds capacity, the other depletes it. Many people confuse self-control with strength, but strength that relies on self-attack is unstable. It requires constant pressure. The moment pressure drops, collapse follows. This cycle creates burnout. Burnout is not a failure of willpower, it is a failure of relationship. A relationship with yourself built on criticism cannot be sustained. Shame-based control also fragments the self. Parts of you are labeled acceptable, other parts are exiled, anger is suppressed, sadness is minimized, desire is policed. This fragmentation creates inner conflict. Inner conflict drains energy. You are always fighting yourself. Progress feels hollow because it is achieved at the cost of wholeness. This inner violence often hides behind productivity. You stay busy to avoid feeling inadequate. You stay disciplined to avoid feeling weak. But these strategies do not heal shame. They feed it. Shame tells you that worth must be earned. Compassion tells you that worth is inherent. These two messages cannot coexist peacefully. When shame is in charge, compassion feels undeserved. This is why self-kindness often feels uncomfortable. It triggers suspicion. If I am gentle with myself, will I become lazy? This fear misunderstands how humans actually grow. Growth does not come from punishment. It comes from safety. When the nervous system feels safe, learning accelerates. When it feels threatened, learning narrows. Compassion restores balance by changing the internal environment. Instead of forcing change, it creates conditions where change can happen naturally. This does not mean abandoning discipline. It means redefining it. Discipline rooted in compassion listens to limits. It respects cycles. It adapts. For example, compassionate discipline notices fatigue and responds with rest rather than criticism. It notices emotional pain and responds with curiosity rather than suppression. Shame-based control often treats emotions as obstacles. Compassion treats them as signals. Signals guide behavior. Suppressed signals create confusion. Self-control, rooted in shame, often relies on comparison. You measure yourself against ideals, others, or imagined standards. Comparison keeps shame alive. Compassion replaces comparison with attunement. Attunement means listening inwardly. It means asking, what is needed right now, rather than what should I be doing? This question shifts authority from external standards to internal wisdom. Internal wisdom is quieter. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It guides gently. Violence against the self also shows up in language. The way you speak to yourself matters. Harsh internal dialogue keeps the nervous system on edge. It reinforces a sense of danger. Compassionate language does not excuse harmful behavior. It contextualizes it. It recognizes causes instead of assigning blame. When you make a mistake, shame says, this proves who you are. Compassion says, this shows where support is needed. One collapses possibility, the other opens it. Balance returns when discipline serves life rather than identity. You act not to become worthy, but because something matters. Motivation shifts from fear to care. This shift often feels unfamiliar. Shame-driven systems are loud. Compassionate systems are quiet. Quiet can feel empty at first, but emptiness here is space. In this space, rest becomes possible without guilt. Play becomes possible without justification. Effort becomes more sustainable because it is not fueled by self-hatred. Compassion also reconnects you to your body. Instead of overriding signals, you listen. Hunger, fatigue, tension, and emotion become guides rather than enemies. Listening builds trust. Trust reduces the need for control. When you trust yourself, you do not need to dominate yourself. Self-trust grows through experience. Each time you respond with care instead of punishment, you reinforce a new pattern. Over time, this pattern becomes default. There may be fear that compassion will remove standards. In reality, it refines them. Standards become aligned with values rather than shame. Values-driven discipline is flexible. It adjusts when conditions change. Shame-driven discipline is rigid. It breaks under pressure. Balance is not static. It is dynamic. Compassion allows for recalibration. Shame demands perfection. When compassion leads, failure is information, not indictment. Information guides learning. Indictment freezes it. This does not mean abandoning accountability. Accountability without compassion becomes cruelty. Accountability with compassion becomes growth. Violence against the self often mirrors violence experienced earlier in life. Internal control replaces external control. Compassion interrupts this cycle. By offering yourself what was missing, safety, patience, understanding, you heal not only current behavior, but old wounds. This healing does not happen instantly. The voice of shame may persist for a while. Compassion does not silence it by force. It responds with steadiness. Over time, the voice loses authority, not because it was defeated, but because it was understood. Discipline rooted in compassion feels different in the body. There is effort, but also ease. There is direction, but also rest. You still grow, you still change, but you do not bleed in the process. Balance is restored when self-control becomes self-care, when guidance replaces domination, when kindness becomes strength. This transformation does not make you weaker, it makes you whole. And wholeness does not require constant control to exist. When shame loosens its grip, discipline becomes an expression of respect rather than punishment. And in that respect, something long strained finally relaxes. As compassion replaces harsh self-control, a new temptation quietly appears. The urge to rest inside acceptance becomes so relieving that it risks turning into something else, something softer on the surface, but just as avoidant underneath. This is where surrender can be misunderstood, and where trust in life can slip into denial. There is a kind of relief that comes when you stop fighting yourself, when shame loosens, when discipline becomes humane. In that relief, it is easy to say, everything is fine, even when it is not. It is easy to call avoidance peace. It is easy to mistake detachment for wisdom. This is where spiritual bypassing begins. Spiritual bypassing happens when spiritual ideas are used to avoid uncomfortable realities. It sounds calm, it sounds accepting, but underneath, something essential is missing. Responsibility, boundaries, discernment. Without these, surrender becomes dissociation. Trusting life does not mean pretending harm is harmless. It does not mean ignoring patterns that need attention. It does not mean staying in situations that erode your dignity or safety. True trust is grounded, not airy. It is rooted in awareness, not escape. Many people confuse surrender with passivity because they are tired. Tired of effort, tired of self-correction, tired of control. In that exhaustion, the idea of just letting everything be feels like relief. But letting everything be without clarity often leads to repetition of suffering. Surrender without discernment is not freedom. It is resignation, and resignation carries quiet resentment. Resentment turns inward or outward over time. It does not dissolve simply because it is dressed in spiritual language. Trusting life begins with seeing life clearly, not as ideal, not as benevolent in every moment, but as complex, capable of beauty and harm, growth and decay, wisdom and ignorance. Trust does not deny this complexity, it learns to navigate it. Spiritual bypassing often shows up as premature acceptance. You accept before you feel, you forgive before you grieve, you let go before you understand. This creates an emotional backlog. What is bypassed does not disappear. It resurfaces later, often louder. True surrender includes emotional honesty. If something hurts, it is acknowledged. If something feels wrong, it is examined. Trust does not silence intuition, it sharpens it. Boundaries are often misunderstood as control, but boundaries are not about dominating others. They are about clarity of self. A boundary says, "This is where I end and you begin." Without boundaries, trust becomes confusion. Trusting life does not require you to tolerate harm. It requires you to recognize what is happening without distortion. Sometimes the most trusting act is to step away, to say no, to protect what is vulnerable. Spiritual bypassing often discourages anger. Anger is labeled unspiritual, but anger is not the enemy. Unexamined anger is. Anger contains information about violation, injustice, and unmet needs. When anger is bypassed, those needs remain unmet. Trusting life means trusting your emotional signals, not acting them out impulsively, but listening to them. Discernment grows from listening, not suppressing. There is also a misconception that surrender means giving up effort. In reality, surrender changes the quality of effort. Effort becomes responsive instead of forceful. You act because something is needed, not because you are trying to control outcomes. Spiritual bypassing avoids responsibility by attributing everything to fate, karma, or divine will. While these ideas can offer perspective, they can also be used to avoid accountability. Responsibility grounds spirituality in lived reality. You are responsible for how you speak, how you act, how you repair harm. Surrender does not absolve you of this. It supports it by reducing defensiveness. When you trust life, you also trust cause and effect. Actions matter. Choices shape experience. Trust does not deny consequences. It works with them. Another sign of bypassing is the refusal to engage with complexity. Everything is reduced to simple explanations. Pain is minimized. Conflict is spiritualized away. This creates distance from real life. Trusting life means staying engaged even when things are messy. It means being willing to feel confused, to ask hard questions, to admit uncertainty. Certainty is often a refuge from fear. Trust can tolerate not knowing. Non-attachment is often misunderstood as non-involvement. In Buddhism, non-attachment does not mean not caring. It means caring without clinging. You show up fully without demanding control over results. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Bypassing disengages. True surrender remains present. Trusting life also means trusting yourself. Not the ego's need to be right, but your capacity to respond wisely. This trust grows through experience. Each time you face difficulty without collapsing or avoiding, trust deepens. Spiritual bypassing avoids discomfort by staying abstract. It talks about love without touching pain. It speaks of peace without addressing injustice. This creates a split between values and behavior. Integration heals this split. Integration means your spirituality shows up in how you live, not just how you think, in how you treat others, in how you set limits, in how you repair mistakes. Trust without boundaries often leads to exploitation. Trust with boundaries creates safety. Safety allows openness. This is not contradiction, it is balance. Discernment is the capacity to see clearly. It is not judgment, it is recognition. Discernment notices patterns. It notices when something consistently causes harm. It notices when change is unlikely. Trusting life includes trusting these observations, not overriding them with idealism, not denying them with hope. Hope without realism becomes denial. Surrender also does not mean suppressing desire. Desire points to aliveness. Problems arise when desire turns into grasping. Surrender allows desire to exist without letting it dominate behavior. Spiritual bypassing often treats desire as something to transcend. This creates repression. Repressed desire leaks out in unhealthy ways. Trust allows desire to be known without being obeyed blindly. This same principle applies to fear. Fear is not something to eliminate. It is something to listen to and contextualize. Some fears are protective, others are habitual. Discernment tells the difference. Trusting life means trusting your ability to tell the difference. That ability grows with practice, not avoidance. True surrender also includes grief. Grief for what cannot be fixed. Grief for what did not happen. Grief for limits. Bypassing tries to skip grief by reframing it too quickly. Trust allows grief its time. Time is often what bypassing refuses to give. There is a rush to transcend, to rise above, to move on. Trust slows down. It respects process. Slowing down reveals truth. Truth is sometimes uncomfortable, but discomfort is not danger. Avoiding discomfort creates distortion. Trusting life also means trusting relationship, allowing feedback, being open to correction. Bypassing isolates by claiming higher understanding. Trust remains humble. Humility is essential here. Humility does not mean shrinking. It means acknowledging that perception is partial, that learning continues, that mistakes will happen. Surrender without humility becomes arrogance. Arrogance disconnects you from others and from reality. Trust reconnects. Spiritual bypassing often avoids conflict. Conflict is seen as unspiritual, but conflict handled with awareness can be transformative. Avoiding it leads to stagnation. Trusting life means trusting that conflict can be navigated without destruction. It means engaging honestly while staying regulated. This regulation comes from embodiment. Staying connected to the body keeps spirituality grounded. The body does not bypass. It registers what is real. Practices that disconnect you from sensation increase bypassing. Practices that deepen presence reduce it. Presence brings responsibility back into focus. Trusting life also involves trusting limits. You cannot save everyone. You cannot fix everything. Accepting limits prevents burnout and resentment. Limits are not failures. They are conditions. Working within conditions is wisdom. Spiritual bypassing often ignores power dynamics. It treats all situations as equal expressions of growth. This can excuse harm. Trusting life includes acknowledging imbalance and protecting the vulnerable. Compassion without discernment becomes naivety. Discernment without compassion becomes cruelty. Balance requires both. Trusting life is not blind faith. It is an informed openness, an openness that sees clearly, feels deeply, and responds appropriately. Surrender here is active. It stays awake. It notices when something is out of alignment and responds without panic. This kind of surrender does not remove effort. It removes force. Effort guided by clarity is sustainable. Force driven by fear is not. As bypassing falls away, trust becomes more embodied, less about beliefs, more about presence, less about ideals, more about lived truth. You stop using spirituality to escape life and start using it to meet life. This is where trust becomes real. Real trust does not deny pain. It walks with it. It does not erase responsibility. It embraces it without self-punishment. It does not abandon boundaries. It respects them as expressions of care. In this balance, surrender stops being a concept and becomes a way of relating. You remain open without being unprotected. You remain compassionate without being passive. You remain trusting without being naive, and in that balance, life feels less like something to escape into meaning and more like something you can stand inside with clarity, responsibility, and quiet confidence. As trust becomes grounded instead of idealized, another attachment quietly reveals itself. Even when control softens, even when responsibility and discernment are held with care, the mind often clings to one last demand, the demand to understand, to explain, to close the loop. And when that demand is not met, tension returns. There is a particular discomfort that arises when something ends without explanation. A conversation that never happened, a relationship that faded without clarity, a loss that makes no sense. The mind reacts by searching. It wants a reason, a lesson, a final answer that will make the experience feel complete. This search feels natural. Meaning creates orientation. Answers create a sense of safety, but not every experience offers resolution. Some events leave questions open. Some pain does not organize itself into a neat story. When the mind insists on closure where none is available, suffering continues long after the event has passed. Closure is often mistaken for peace. The belief is simple: if I understand why this happened, I will be free. But understanding does not always bring relief. Sometimes it deepens rumination. Sometimes it becomes another way of revisiting pain. The need for closure is a form of control. It is the mind trying to finish something emotionally by finishing it intellectually. But emotional processes do not always follow logic. They move through sensation, time, and acceptance. Many people believe they cannot move forward without answers. Yet life shows otherwise. People move forward every day without fully understanding their past. What allows movement is not resolution, but capacity. Capacity to hold uncertainty without collapsing. Acceptance does not guarantee explanation. It offers something different. It offers the ability to live with unanswered questions without being consumed by them. The mind often confuses not knowing with danger. Uncertainty feels like instability, but uncertainty is not the same as chaos. It is simply the absence of narrative closure. Narratives give the ego coherence. They tell a story about who you are and why things happened. When a story cannot be completed, the ego feels threatened. It fears fragmentation. But fragmentation does not come from unanswered questions. It comes from refusing to allow experience to remain open. The fight for closure creates more disturbance than the lack of answers. There are experiences that cannot be explained without distortion. Trying to explain them reduces their complexity. Loss, betrayal, sudden change, and deep love often fall into this category. Any explanation feels insufficient. When the mind insists on closure, it often settles for false certainty. It creates explanations that blame, idealize, or oversimplify. These explanations feel relieving at first, but they rarely last. Doubt returns. The freedom of not needing closure begins when you recognize that peace does not depend on understanding everything. Peace depends on your relationship with not knowing. Not knowing does not mean ignorance. It means humility. It means acknowledging the limits of perspective. It means accepting that some things unfold beyond comprehension. This acceptance is not passive. It requires strength. The strength to stay present without filling gaps prematurely. The strength to feel without explanation. The body often processes experiences faster than the mind. You may notice that even without answers, your body slowly settles. Sleep improves. Breath deepens. Moments of ease appear. This is healing without closure. The mind may protest this. It says, "But I still don't understand." Understanding is not the same as integration. Integration happens when experience is allowed to settle into the system without being constantly interrogated. Interrogation keeps the nervous system alert. Alertness prevents rest. Rest allows integration. Integration reduces suffering. Many people chase closure because they believe it will prevent future pain. If I understand this, it won't happen again. But life does not offer that guarantee. Even fully understood pain can repeat. What changes is how you meet it. Not needing closure builds resilience. Resilience does not come from certainty. It comes from adaptability. Adaptability grows when you learn to live without full control of meaning. There is also grief hidden in the need for closure. Grief for the story you wanted. Grief for the explanation you deserved but never received. Allowing this grief is more healing than forcing an answer. When closure is not available, the invitation is to grieve the absence of closure itself. This grief is often overlooked, but it matters. Acceptance here means letting the question exist without demanding it resolve. The question may soften over time. It may lose urgency. It may remain. None of these outcomes require force. The mind often worries that without closure, life will feel incomplete. But life is always incomplete. It is ongoing. Closure is a mental preference, not a requirement for living. In Buddhism, clinging to views is a source of suffering. Views include explanations, beliefs, and conclusions about experience. Letting go of the need for closure is letting go of a view. This does not mean rejecting meaning altogether. It means allowing meaning to be provisional, flexible, open to change. Sometimes understanding comes years later. Sometimes it never comes. Sometimes the understanding that comes is different from what you expected. Acceptance allows this variability. Peace without resolution feels different. It is quieter. It does not provide a sense of triumph. It feels like less effort, less mental noise, less revisiting. This peace often arrives gradually. You notice you think about the event less. When you do think about it, it hurts less. Not because you solved it, but because you stopped fighting its unsolved nature. Not needing closure also changes how you relate to others. You stop demanding explanations they cannot give. You stop waiting for apologies that may never come. This does not excuse harm. It frees you from waiting. Waiting for closure from others gives them power over your peace. Releasing that need returns power to you. This does not mean suppressing the desire for answers. It means acknowledging the desire without obeying it. Desire can exist without being satisfied. When the desire for closure is seen clearly, it loosens. You see it as a habit of mind rather than a necessity. The mind learns that it can tolerate unresolved questions. This tolerance reduces anxiety. Anxiety thrives on the belief that uncertainty is unbearable. Tolerance of uncertainty is a mature capacity. It develops through practice. Each time you allow a question to remain open without spinning stories, capacity grows. This practice also deepens presence. Without the pull of explanation, attention returns to what is happening now. The present moment does not require closure. It requires contact. Contact with life, as it is, brings vitality. Vitality does not depend on understanding the past or predicting the future. It arises from engagement with now. Not needing closure also allows forgiveness without reconciliation. You can release bitterness without restoring relationship. This protects boundaries while freeing the heart. Forgiveness here is not a moral act. It is a release of fixation. Fixation keeps pain active. Release allows it to settle. Some people fear that without closure, they will forget important lessons. But lessons that matter integrate without effort. They show up in behavior, not in explanations. You do not need to remember every detail of pain to avoid repeating it. The body remembers. Awareness remembers. Closure often promises finality. Life offers continuity. Continuity means experiences blend into each other. They inform, but do not dominate. When you stop demanding closure, you allow experience to take its place in the larger flow of life. It becomes part of you without defining you. This does not mean indifference. You may still care deeply. You may still feel sadness. But the edge softens, the grip loosens. Peace without resolution feels like standing on open ground. There is no wall behind you, no neat ending, just space. At first, space can feel exposed. Over time, it feels liberating. There is room to move, room to breathe, room to live without constantly looking backward. The mind may still ask questions from time to time. That is natural. The difference is that the questions no longer demand answers to allow life to continue. Life continues anyway. Acceptance allows you to continue with it. This freedom is subtle. It does not announce itself. It shows up as less urgency, less obsession, more ease with complexity. You begin to trust that not everything needs to be resolved to be meaningful, that not every story needs an ending to be lived fully. In this trust, peace stops being something you achieve through understanding. It becomes something that arises when you stop insisting that experience conform to your need for explanation. Not needing closure does not make life simpler. It makes it more honest. And honesty, even when incomplete, is more peaceful than forced resolution. You learn to live with open questions the way you live with open skies, not trying to close them, just letting them be. And in that openness, something unexpected happens. Life feels less heavy, not because it makes sense, but because you are no longer demanding that it does. Peace exists there, quiet, unresolved, real. As the need for answers loosens and peace is found without resolution, another attachment quietly comes into focus. It is more intimate than explanations and more persistent than questions. It is the attachment to who you believe you are. And just like every form of control before it, This attachment once promised safety. There is a subtle tension that appears when life begins to change you in ways you did not plan. A tightening when you feel yourself acting differently, thinking differently, responding differently. The mind quickly steps in and says, "That's not me." This reaction is not random. It is the ego protecting an identity it believes must remain stable. Identity gives structure. It tells a story about your past and offers a prediction for your future. It says, "This is who I am, this is what I do, this is how I respond." That story creates continuity. Continuity feels safe, but safety built on fixed identity comes with a hidden cost. Clinging to identity is a form of control. It is the attempt to stabilize the self in a world that is constantly changing. When you say, "This is just how I am," you are often trying to protect against uncertainty, vulnerability, and the discomfort of not knowing who you are becoming. Identity can be useful. It helps you navigate the world. But when identity becomes rigid, it resists growth. Growth requires openness. Identity says, "Stay the same." Awakening requires flexibility. Identity says, "Be consistent." This tension shows up whenever life invites change. You may feel drawn to new values, new ways of being, new perspectives, but identity steps in with fear. If I change, who will I be? This fear keeps you loyal to an outdated version of yourself. Attachment to identity often masquerades as authenticity. You tell yourself you are being true to who you are. But authenticity is not loyalty to a fixed self. It is honesty with the present moment. Sometimes honesty reveals that who you were is no longer who you are. Identity also shapes how you interpret experience. Events are filtered through self-concept. Praise reinforces identity. Criticism threatens it. Feedback becomes dangerous when it challenges the image you hold. This is why identity attachment creates defensiveness. Defensiveness is not about disagreement, it is about protection. Protection of a self-image that feels necessary for survival. When identity is threatened, the nervous system reacts as if something essential is at risk. Shame, anger, withdrawal, or justification appear. These reactions are not personal flaws, they are protective responses to perceived annihilation of self. But the self that feels threatened is not as solid as it appears. Identity is a collection of memories, roles, beliefs, and habits. It is constructed, useful, but not fixed. When you cling to it, you treat it as permanent. Impermanence applies to identity as much as it applies to everything else. You are not the same person you were years ago. You will not be the same person years from now. Trying to freeze identity creates inner conflict. This conflict often shows up as resistance to learning. Learning requires admitting you don't know. Identity often insists you already do. This blocks curiosity. It also shows up as resistance to vulnerability. Vulnerability requires not knowing how you will be seen. Identity wants control over perception. Identity attachment also limits awakening. Awakening is not adding something to who you are. It is loosening the grip on who you think you must be. When identity is defended at all costs, awakening feels threatening rather than liberating. Many people approach spiritual growth by trying to become a better version of their identity, more peaceful, more wise, more spiritual, but this approach keeps identity at the center. It subtly reinforces control. True transformation often feels like loss before it feels like gain. You lose certainty. You lose familiar narratives. You lose the comfort of knowing how to describe yourself. Identity resists this loss. This resistance can look like clinging to labels. Labels about personality, history, trauma, spirituality, or beliefs. Labels can offer understanding, but they can also become cages. When you say, "This is just how I am," you may be closing the door to change. When you say, "This is what happened to me," you may be freezing an experience that wants to integrate and move. Identity also creates separation. You define yourself against others. You become invested in difference. Difference reinforces identity. Similarity threatens it. This separation limits compassion. When you cling to identity, you see others through the lens of self and other. When identity softens, shared humanity becomes more visible. Identity attachment also fuels comparison. You measure yourself against others to confirm who you are. Comparison keeps the ego active. It distracts from presence. Presence does not require identity. In presence, there is experience without commentary, sensation, emotion, awareness. No label is needed. This can feel unsettling. Without identity, the mind asks, "Who am I now?" But this question only arises because the mind is used to defining itself. Awareness does not need definition to exist. Buddhist teachings often point to non-self not as a philosophical position, but as a lived experience. When you look closely, you cannot find a fixed self. There are thoughts, feelings, perceptions, but no permanent owner. This realization does not erase personality or function. It removes the rigidity around them. You still respond, but you are not trapped by a story. When identity loosens, growth becomes less threatening. You are not betraying yourself by changing. You are responding to life. Uncertainty becomes more tolerable because you are no longer trying to protect an image. You can say, "I don't know," without feeling diminished. This openness allows learning to resume. Curiosity replaces defense. You listen more. You adapt. Identity attachment often keeps people stuck in roles long after they stop serving. The strong one, the responsible one, the broken one, the healer, the victim. Roles that once helped can become burdens. Letting go of these roles can feel like losing purpose. But purpose does not disappear. It evolves. Identity also influences how you relate to pain. You may identify as someone who is wounded, resilient, or healed. These identities shape how you interpret experience. They can either open or close possibilities. When pain arises, identity may say, "This shouldn't be happening to me anymore." This creates resistance. Resistance prolongs suffering. Without rigid identity, pain is just pain. It does not threaten who you are. It passes more easily. Attachment to identity also affects decision-making. You choose options that fit your self-image rather than what feels true. This creates misalignment. Misalignment creates discomfort. Discomfort signals the need for change. Identity resists this signal. Letting go of identity does not mean becoming nothing. It means becoming responsive. You are shaped by each moment rather than confined by a past description. This responsiveness feels alive. It allows surprise. It allows growth without self-betrayal. The fear beneath identity attachment is fear of disappearance. Fear that without a defined self, you will not exist. But experience shows otherwise. Awareness remains even when identity shifts. In fact, awareness becomes more spacious, less defended, less reactive. Relationships also change when identity loosens. You are less invested in being seen a certain way. Conversations become more honest. Listening deepens. You stop performing yourself. You start showing up. This does not mean chaos. Patterns still exist. Preferences still exist. The difference is flexibility. You are not bound to them. Awakening is often described as remembering rather than becoming. Remembering that you are not the story you tell about yourself. You are the awareness in which the story appears. This remembering can feel destabilizing at first. The ego loses its anchor, but something steadier replaces it. Presence. Presence does not need to be protected. It does not need to be consistent. It adapts naturally. When identity attachment loosens, resistance to growth fades. You are less afraid of change because there is less to lose. This does not remove grief. You may grieve old versions of yourself. That grief is part of integration. Integration happens when identity becomes fluid rather than fixed. You carry your past without being confined by it. Life invites change constantly. Identity tries to negotiate with that invitation. Awakening accepts it. Clinging to who I am once felt like stability. Letting go reveals a deeper stability, one that does not depend on staying the same. This stability is not rigid, it moves, it responds, it remains present even as forms change. When you stop controlling identity, you allow yourself to grow without betrayal. You allow uncertainty without panic. You allow awakening without fear of disappearance. You are still here, more open, less defined, more alive. And in that openness, life no longer feels like something you must protect yourself from. It feels like something you can meet, moment by moment, without needing to know exactly who you are at every step. As identity softens and the grip on who I must be loosens, another fear rises closer to the surface. It is not about losing control over outcomes or meaning anymore. It is about how you might be seen when you stop controlling. The fear of appearing weak, the fear of being exposed, the fear of being powerless. There is a tension that shows up the moment you consider letting others see you without armor. A tightening that says, if they see this, I lose respect. This reaction is deeply conditioned. From early on, many people learned that vulnerability was unsafe, that showing fear invited judgment, that showing sadness invited dismissal. So strength became performance and control became protection. The ego thrives on the appearance of power. Power here does not mean actual capacity. It means image, being composed, being capable, being unaffected. Vulnerability threatens this image because it reveals uncertainty, need, and limitation. The ego confuses these with weakness, but vulnerability is not the absence of strength. It is the absence of pretense, and pretense is exhausting. Control is often an attempt to manage perception. You control what you reveal. You control what you admit. You control how much you need others. This keeps the ego intact, but it keeps connection shallow. The fear of being seen as powerless is not really about others. It is about self-image, about the belief that worth depends on competence and independence. Vulnerability challenges this belief by exposing dependency and uncertainty, which are fundamental parts of being human. When vulnerability is avoided, power becomes rigid. It must be defended constantly. Any crack feels dangerous. This creates anxiety. Anxiety fuels more control. Vulnerability, when allowed, does the opposite. It relaxes the system. You no longer need to perform strength. You can rest in honesty. Many people believe vulnerability will lead to rejection. Sometimes it does. But rejection based on truth is less damaging than acceptance based on performance. Performance requires constant upkeep. Truth does not. Control keeps relationships predictable but distant. Vulnerability introduces unpredictability but depth. Depth is risky, but it is also nourishing. The ego equates vulnerability with loss of status, but status is a social construct. Liberation is internal. Liberation comes from no longer needing to uphold an image to feel okay. Vulnerability exposes need. Need feels dangerous because it implies dependence. But dependence is not failure, it is reality. Humans are relational beings. Control tries to deny this. When you admit need, you give others the opportunity to meet you. This meeting creates connection. Control prevents meeting because it keeps you sealed. The fear of being powerless also shows up in conflict. You may control conversations to avoid admitting uncertainty. You may dominate discussions to avoid feeling small. This creates distance and escalates tension. Vulnerability in conflict looks like saying, "I don't know," or "this hurts," or "I'm scared." These statements de-escalate because they shift the interaction from power struggle to human exchange. Power struggles arise when both sides protect ego. Vulnerability dissolves the struggle because there is nothing to defend. There is also fear that vulnerability will lead to being taken advantage of. This fear has roots. Past experiences of betrayal or neglect teach the nervous system to protect itself. Control becomes a shield. But shielding everything also blocks nourishment. Discernment, not total control, is what protects. Discernment chooses where vulnerability is shared. Control suppresses it everywhere. Liberation does not mean exposing yourself indiscriminately. It means allowing vulnerability where it is safe and appropriate. This is wisdom, not weakness. Vulnerability also changes how you relate to failure. When identity and control dominate, failure threatens self-worth. Vulnerability allows failure to be part of learning rather than proof of inadequacy. Admitting mistakes becomes easier. Repair becomes possible. Growth accelerates because energy is not spent on hiding. The ego resists this because it equates vulnerability with humiliation. But humiliation comes from judgment, not from openness. When vulnerability is met with compassion, it becomes empowering. Even when vulnerability is not met well, it still frees you internally. You no longer carry the burden of concealment. Concealment is heavy. Honesty is lighter. Control also blocks emotional intimacy. You may share facts but not feelings, opinions but not fears. This keeps relationships functional but not fulfilling. Vulnerability invites reciprocity. When one person opens, others often follow. This creates mutual trust. Trust reduces the need for control. The fear of powerlessness often hides a deeper fear of abandonment. If I am vulnerable, will I be left? Control tries to prevent this by appearing strong, but strength does not guarantee connection. Authenticity does. Liberation comes when you realize that you cannot control how others respond to your vulnerability. And you do not need to. Your freedom does not depend on their approval. When you allow yourself to be seen as you are, you reclaim energy. Energy, once used to manage perception, becomes available for living. Vulnerability also reconnects you to your body. Control often keeps awareness in the mind. Vulnerability brings attention to sensation, breath, emotion. This embodiment grounds you. Grounded vulnerability feels different from collapse. Collapse is overwhelm. Grounded vulnerability is openness with support. Support may come from breath, posture, environment, or trusted people. The ego fears vulnerability because it threatens the illusion of separateness. Vulnerability reveals interdependence. Interdependence challenges the ego's narrative of self-sufficiency. But interdependence is not weakness. It is how systems thrive. Ecosystems survive through connection, not isolation. Vulnerability also allows grief to be shared. Shared grief is less heavy. Control isolates grief. Isolation magnifies pain. Liberation through vulnerability does not mean constant emotional exposure. It means not hiding from your own experience. It means acknowledging fear, sadness, joy, and uncertainty internally, even when you choose not to share externally. This internal honesty is the foundation. External sharing is secondary. You cannot be vulnerable with others if you are not vulnerable with yourself. Self-vulnerability means admitting confusion, admitting limitation, admitting that you do not have it all together. This admission reduces pressure. Pressure is a form of violence. The fear of being powerless also affects leadership. Many leaders control to avoid appearing uncertain. This creates rigidity. Leaders who allow vulnerability create trust. Trust improves cooperation. This applies in families, workplaces, and communities. Vulnerability humanizes authority. Control dehumanizes it. Liberation is not about losing power, it is about redefining power. Power is not domination, it is capacity. Capacity to feel, capacity to respond, capacity to stay present under stress. Vulnerability expands capacity. Control constricts it. When you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you discover that you survive exposure. The nervous system learns that openness is not fatal. This learning reduces fear over time. Fear diminishes when experience contradicts it. Each moment of safe vulnerability rewires expectation. The ego may still protest. It may warn of danger. You do not silence it by force. You listen, assess, and choose consciously. choice is key. Vulnerability chosen is empowering. Vulnerability forced is traumatizing. Control often arises from past forced vulnerability. Healing restores choice. Liberation does not require abandoning protection entirely. It requires flexibility, the ability to open and close as needed. Control is rigid, vulnerability is fluid. As vulnerability becomes familiar, the fear of being seen as powerless fades. You realize that power was never in hiding. It was in presence. Presence does not need to impress. It does not need to dominate. It simply meets what is. This meeting is freeing. You stop acting strong and start being real. Realness attracts connection that does not depend on performance. When you no longer fear being seen without armor, you move through life with less resistance, less need to manage impressions, less fear of exposure. Liberation here is subtle. It feels like relief. Relief from carrying an image. Relief from constant defense. You still have strength. But it is quieter. It is not something you prove. It is something you trust. And in that trust, vulnerability stops being a threat and starts being what it always was, a doorway into connection, authenticity, and freedom from the exhausting need to control how you are seen. As the fear of being seen without armor begins to fade, a deeper unease quietly takes its place. It is not about exposure anymore. It is about not knowing what will happen, not knowing who you are becoming, not knowing what the next step should be. And for a mind trained to equate certainty with safety, this can feel like standing on open ground with no map. There is a subtle panic that arises when answers fall away. A reflex to reach for conclusions, beliefs, plans, or identities to regain footing. This reflex is understandable. From an early age, knowing was rewarded. Having answers meant competence. Not knowing meant weakness. Over time, uncertainty became something to escape rather than something to inhabit. Yet Buddhist practice points to a counterintuitive truth. Not knowing is not a gap to be filled. It is a space to rest in. And learning to rest there is not regression, it is maturity. Uncertainty is often mistaken for confusion, but confusion is agitation. Uncertainty is openness. Confusion says something is wrong. Uncertainty says something is unfolding. One tightens the body, the other softens it. The ego resists uncertainty because it cannot control it. Certainty gives the ego structure. It tells a story about cause and effect, about right and wrong, about where things are headed. Uncertainty dissolves that structure. The ego fears dissolution, but awareness does not fear uncertainty. Awareness is spacious enough to hold it. When you stop trying to resolve not knowing, awareness becomes more present, more grounded, more alive. Many people believe that spiritual growth means accumulating insight, more understanding, more clarity, more certainty. But in Buddhist teachings, wisdom often looks like the opposite. It looks like the willingness to stay with questions without rushing to answers. This willingness is not passive. It is deeply attentive. It requires staying present with discomfort. It requires trust in experience rather than belief. It requires patience. Patience here is not waiting for certainty to arrive. It is allowing uncertainty to be as it is. This allowance changes your relationship to life. When you allow uncertainty, you stop treating it as an emergency. The nervous system begins to settle. You realize that not knowing does not mean danger. It means openness. Openness allows learning. Certainty often blocks it. When you think you already know, curiosity shuts down. When you admit you don't, curiosity awakens. Curiosity is gentle. It does not demand. It explores. It notices. It listens. This quality is central to Buddhist practice. Allowing uncertainty also reduces mental violence. The mind often attacks itself for not knowing. I should have figured this out by now. I should be further along. These judgments create suffering. When you allow not knowing, you stop punishing yourself for being human. You recognize that growth is not linear and clarity does not arrive on command. Uncertainty also reveals impermanence in real time. Plans change, insights shift. What felt true yesterday feels incomplete today. Allowing uncertainty means allowing this movement without clinging. Clinging to certainty creates rigidity. Rigidity creates fear of change. Fear of change fuels control. Allowing uncertainty breaks this cycle. The practice of allowing uncertainty often begins in small moments. You notice the urge to decide prematurely, to label an experience, to conclude what it means. Instead, you pause. This pause is powerful. It interrupts habitual patterns. It creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, wisdom can emerge. Wisdom here is not a thought. It is a felt sense, a knowing that arises from presence rather than analysis. Not knowing also humbles the mind. Humility is not self-diminishment. It is accurate self-perception. It acknowledges the limits of perspective. This humility reduces arrogance and defensiveness. You become more open to others' views, less attached to being right, more interested in understanding. Allowing uncertainty also deepens compassion. When you accept your own not knowing, you become more patient with others. You stop expecting people to have everything figured out. This patience improves relationships. Conversations become explorations rather than debates. Listening becomes more genuine. The fear behind uncertainty is often the fear of making mistakes. If I don't know, I might choose wrong, but mistakes are part of learning. Avoiding mistakes through over-certainty limits growth. Allowing uncertainty means accepting the possibility of error without self-condemnation. This acceptance builds resilience. Resilience grows not from control, but from adaptability. Adaptability requires flexibility. Flexibility requires openness. Uncertainty provides that openness. In meditation, uncertainty often shows up as restlessness. The mind wants something to focus on, something to resolve. Allowing uncertainty means noticing this restlessness without obeying it. You sit, you breathe. Thoughts arise, questions arise. You let them be. This practice trains the nervous system to tolerate ambiguity. Over time, tolerance becomes ease. Ease becomes trust. Trust here is not belief that things will work out. It is trust that you can meet whatever arises without needing to know everything in advance. This trust reduces anxiety. Anxiety feeds on imagined futures. Allowing uncertainty brings attention back to the present. The present moment does not require answers, it requires awareness. Allowing uncertainty also challenges spiritual pride, the belief that awakening means constant clarity. In reality, awakening often increases sensitivity to complexity. As awareness deepens, simplistic answers fall away. Life appears more nuanced. This can feel destabilizing at first. But this destabilization is not loss, it is expansion. You are seeing more, not less. Not knowing becomes a sign of depth. It means you are no longer satisfied with surface explanations. You are willing to stay with mystery. Mystery is not ignorance. It is reverence for what cannot be reduced to concept. Buddhist teachings often emphasize direct experience over belief. Direct experience is always fresh. It cannot be fully predicted or explained. Allowing uncertainty honors this freshness. When you stop demanding certainty, life feels less rigid. You become more responsive. You adjust as conditions change. This responsiveness is different from indecision. Indecision is paralysis. Responsiveness is engagement without fixation. You act when action is needed. You wait when waiting is appropriate. You do not force clarity where it has not yet formed. Allowing uncertainty also reduces fear of the unknown. Fear thrives when the unknown is treated as hostile. When you allow uncertainty, the unknown becomes neutral. Neutrality creates space. Space allows creativity. Creativity emerges when the mind is not confined by fixed outcomes. Many insights arise unexpectedly, not through effort but through relaxation. When the mind stops pushing for answers, answers sometimes appear on their own. And when they don't, life still continues. You still live, you still breathe, you still respond. This realization is liberating. You see that certainty was never required for living. It was a preference, not a necessity. Allowing uncertainty also softens the need for identity. If you don't know who you are becoming, you are less attached to who you were. This openness supports growth. Growth does not announce itself. It unfolds quietly, often unnoticed until later. Not knowing also teaches patience with process. Some things take time. Some understanding matures slowly. Forcing it distorts it. This patience reduces frustration. Frustration comes from wanting resolution before readiness. Readiness cannot be forced. It arises naturally when conditions align. Allowing uncertainty is an act of respect toward reality. It acknowledges that life is complex and cannot be fully controlled or predicted. This respect fosters humility and care. You stop imposing your will and start listening. Listening is central here. Listening to the body, listening to emotions, listening to circumstances, listening to silence. Silence is often where uncertainty feels most present. Without noise, questions echo. But silence is also where presence deepens. When you rest in not knowing, silence becomes less threatening. It becomes spacious. In this space, you are not required to perform understanding. You are allowed to simply be. Being without knowing is deeply restful. It releases the constant pressure to figure things out. This rest does not make you passive. It makes you attentive. Attentiveness without agenda is powerful. It allows you to notice subtle shifts. It allows intuition to emerge. Intuition is not certainty, it is sensitivity. Sensitivity thrives in openness. Allowing uncertainty also changes how you relate to spiritual teachings. You stop using them as answers and start using them as pointers. Pointers guide attention, not conclusions. They invite exploration rather than belief. This exploration keeps practice alive. It prevents stagnation. Stagnation often comes from believing you have arrived. Not knowing keeps the path open. The mature spiritual capacity is not constant confidence. It is comfort with ambiguity. Comfort with not having the final word. This comfort does not mean indifference. It means engagement without rigidity. You care deeply. You act sincerely. You hold values. But you do not demand that life conform to your understanding. When understanding changes, you adjust. This adjustment becomes natural, less dramatic, less threatening. Allowing uncertainty also prepares you for loss. Loss often brings unanswered questions. If you can rest in not knowing, loss is less destabilizing. You grieve without needing explanation. You mourn without needing justification. This does not remove pain. It removes resistance to pain. Resistance intensifies suffering. Allowance softens it. Over time, allowing uncertainty becomes a quiet confidence. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in presence. Presence is enough. It meets whatever arises. You may still seek understanding. Curiosity does not disappear. The difference is urgency. Urgency dissolves. Inquiry remains. Inquiry without urgency is gentle. It respects timing. It listens more than it demands. This quality permeates life. Conversations become less about proving. Decisions become less pressured. Waiting becomes more tolerable. Life feels less like a test and more like a process. You stop asking, "When will I know?" and start asking, "What is here now?" This question anchors you. Allowing uncertainty does not make life smaller. It makes it wider, more breathable, less constrained by fear. In that wideness, you discover that not knowing was never a failure. It was an invitation. An invitation to stay present, to remain open, to trust awareness rather than answers. And as you accept this invitation again and again, uncertainty loses its edge. It becomes a companion rather than an enemy. You no longer rush to close it. You learn to stand within it. And in standing there, you find a quiet stability that certainty never provided. As resting in not knowing becomes more familiar, something else begins to shift quietly in the background. The mind loosens its grip on answers, but another habit remains active. Expectations. Expectations about how life should unfold, how people should behave, how healing should look, how suffering should resolve. These expectations often feel reasonable, even kind, but they carry a hidden cost. There is a subtle closing of the heart that happens when expectations harden, not because you stop caring, but because you start filtering reality through conditions. When things meet those conditions, compassion flows easily. When they don't, compassion narrows, delays, or disappears altogether. Control and compassion cannot fully coexist. Control requires certainty, predictability, and standards. Compassion requires openness, curiosity, and the willingness to meet what is actually present. When expectations become rigid, perception tightens, and what tightens perception blocks compassion. Rigid expectations shape how you see suffering. You may believe that suffering should look a certain way, that pain should be expressed calmly, that healing should progress steadily, that strong people should cope better. These beliefs are rarely conscious, but they influence response. When suffering doesn't match expectation, judgment appears. Not always harsh judgment, sometimes subtle, a quiet impatience, a sense of distance, a thought like, they should be over this by now, or I shouldn't still feel this way. That should closes the door to compassion. Compassion is not agreement, it is not approval, it is accurate seeing. Accurate seeing requires dropping the idea of how things are supposed to be. Control interferes by insisting on form over reality. This happens inwardly first. When you hold rigid expectations about yourself, you limit self-compassion. You may believe you should be stronger, calmer, wiser, more healed. When you fall short of these internal standards, self-criticism replaces care. Self-criticism feels motivating, but it is corrosive. It does not reduce suffering. It adds another layer to it. Compassion would say, this is hard. Control says, this shouldn't be happening. The nervous system feels the difference immediately. Compassion softens, control tightens. Tightening reduces sensitivity. Reduced sensitivity makes it harder to perceive suffering accurately. This misperception extends to others. When you expect people to behave according to your standards, you stop seeing the conditions shaping their behavior. You see choice where there may be capacity limits. You see intention where there may be fear. Compassion depends on context. Control strips context away. It reduces complex human experience to right and wrong, progress and failure, strength and weakness. Buddhist teachings emphasize seeing suffering clearly. Clear seeing requires openness. When expectations dominate, seeing becomes selective. You see what fits your narrative. For example, you may believe compassion means staying calm. When someone expresses pain with anger or chaos, you withdraw. You may label them difficult, but their suffering has not disappeared. It has simply become invisible to you. Control often mistakes composure for health, but many people suffer quietly, others suffer loudly. Compassion does not choose based on presentation. It meets suffering wherever it appears. Rigid expectations also affect empathy. Empathy requires imagination and flexibility. When you assume you know how someone should feel, you stop listening to how they actually feel. Listening is central to compassion. Control interrupts listening by preparing responses, judgments, or fixes. Compassion listens without agenda. Agenda is key here. Control always has one. Even benevolent agendas interfere with compassion. When you approach someone's suffering with the goal of resolving it, you may miss what they need most: to be seen. Being seen is not the same as being fixed. Control focuses on fixing. Compassion focuses on witnessing. Witnessing suffering does not mean passivity. It means presence without distortion. From clear presence, appropriate action can arise, but action that arises before understanding often misses the mark. Rigid expectations also create hierarchy. You see yourself as the one who knows, copes, or understands. Others become examples of what not to be. This hierarchy blocks mutual compassion. Compassion thrives in equality. Equality does not mean sameness. It means recognizing shared vulnerability. Control denies shared vulnerability by insisting on roles. Roles like helper, strong one, healed one, leader. These roles distance you from others' pain. They also distance you from your own. When you cling to the role of the one who has it together, your own suffering becomes unacceptable. You hide it. Compassion towards self diminishes. Compassion towards others becomes conditional. Control also narrows time. You expect suffering to resolve on a schedule. When it doesn't, frustration arises. Frustration is often misdirected at the person who is suffering, but suffering does not follow timelines. Grief, trauma, confusion, and fear move in cycles. Compassion understands this. Control resists it. Resistance shows up as impatience. Impatience communicates withdrawal. It says, "You are taking too long." This message, even when unspoken, deepens suffering. Compassion says, "There is no deadline for pain." This difference matters. When people feel rushed to heal, they often hide pain rather than resolve it. Control creates performance. Compassion creates safety. Safety allows honesty. Honesty allows healing. Rigid expectations also shape moral judgment. You may believe people should know better, choose better, act better. While accountability matters, compassion requires understanding capacity. Capacity varies based on nervous system regulation, history, resources, and support. Control ignores capacity. Compassion considers it. This does not excuse harm. It contextualizes it. Context does not remove responsibility. It informs response. Without context, responses become punitive. Punitive responses may satisfy a sense of control, but they rarely reduce suffering. They often increase it. Control also interferes with forgiveness. Forgiveness requires releasing expectations about how the past should have unfolded. When expectations remain, resentment persists. Resentment is frozen compassion. It is compassion that could not flow because expectations blocked it. This freezing happens internally as well. When you expect yourself to have acted differently, self-forgiveness becomes impossible. You replay mistakes. You punish yourself mentally. Compassion cannot reach you because control guards the gate. Letting go of rigid expectations allows compassion to move again. Movement is essential. Compassion is not static. It flows toward what is present. When expectations soften, curiosity returns. You begin to ask, what is this like for them, rather than, why aren't they doing better? Curiosity opens perception. Perception allows empathy. Empathy fuels compassion. Control prefers answers. Compassion prefers understanding. Understanding is slower, but more accurate. Rigid expectations also limit compassion during conflict. In conflict, you expect others to respond rationally, calmly, fairly. When they don't, you dismiss their suffering and focus on winning. Winning may satisfy control, but it damages connection. Compassion during conflict does not mean agreeing. It means recognizing pain on both sides. Recognizing pain does not weaken your position. It strengthens communication. When people feel seen, defensiveness decreases. Control escalates conflict by insisting on being right. Compassion de-escalates by acknowledging impact. This does not mean abandoning boundaries. Boundaries can coexist with compassion. What blocks compassion is not boundaries, but judgment. Judgment simplifies. Compassion complicates. It allows multiple truths to exist at once. Control prefers simplicity. It wants clean narratives. Compassion tolerates messiness. Messiness includes contradictions. Someone can cause harm and suffer deeply. Someone can be responsible and overwhelmed. Someone can be strong and hurting. Rigid expectations cannot hold these contradictions. Compassion can. Compassion also requires vulnerability. To see suffering clearly, you must allow yourself to feel it. Control avoids feeling by staying analytical. Analysis can be useful, but when it replaces feeling, it blocks compassion. Compassion requires resonance. Resonance happens in the body. Tight control disconnects from bodily awareness. Disconnection limits empathy. When you reconnect with sensation, you become more sensitive to others' pain. Not in a way that overwhelms, but in a way that informs. This sensitivity allows appropriate response. Sometimes response is action, sometimes it is silence, sometimes it is boundary setting. Compassion is flexible, control is rigid. It applies the same response regardless of context. This rigidity shows up in beliefs like, people need tough love, or they're just making excuses. These beliefs may contain partial truths, but when applied universally, they block compassion. Compassion requires specificity. It asks, what is needed here? Control asks, what should be done? The difference is subtle but profound. When you release rigid expectations, compassion becomes more inclusive. You stop reserving it for those who meet your standards. You extend it to yourself when you fall short. This inclusion does not mean permissiveness. It means honesty without cruelty. Cruelty often hides behind control. Control believes suffering should teach lessons. Compassion recognizes that suffering is already teaching something. Adding judgment rarely improves the lesson. Compassion also restores humility. You recognize that under different conditions you might behave similarly. This recognition dissolves superiority. Superiority blocks compassion. Equality enables it. As compassion deepens, the need for control weakens. You no longer need people to be different in order to care. You no longer need yourself to be perfect to be worthy of kindness. This does not reduce standards, it humanizes them. Humanized standards are adaptable. They account for context, they evolve. Compassion changes how you relate to your own expectations. You notice when expectations are rigid and soften them. You replace should with this is. This is open space. Space allows compassion to move. Compassion moving does not solve everything. It does something more fundamental. It reduces isolation. Isolation intensifies suffering. Compassion reconnects. When control loosens, perception widens. You see suffering where you once saw failure. You see fear where you once saw resistance. You see exhaustion where you once saw laziness. This seeing does not make you naive. It makes you accurate. Accuracy is kindness. Kindness grounded in accuracy does not collapse under complexity. It remains steady. This steadiness is what allows you to stay present with suffering without needing to fix it immediately. Presence is often the most compassionate response. Control wants to end discomfort quickly. Compassion is willing to stay. Staying changes things, not always externally, but internally. It communicates you are not alone in this. That message matters. As expectations soften, compassion becomes less conditional, less performative, less strained. It becomes a natural response rather than a moral obligation. And when compassion flows freely, something else happens. Your own suffering becomes easier to meet. You stop fighting it. You stop demanding it resolve on schedule. You see yourself with the same clarity you offer others, not through judgment, through understanding. This understanding does not remove pain. It removes resistance to pain. Resistance is what magnifies suffering. Compassion dissolves resistance. When control steps aside, compassion steps forward, not as sentimentality, but as clear seeing infused with care. Clear seeing does not look away from suffering. It looks directly, without distortion, and in that direct seeing, something soft but powerful emerges. A response rooted not in expectation, but in presence. That presence is what allows compassion to flow toward others, toward yourself, toward life as it is. Not because it should be different, but because it is here. As compassion begins to flow more freely and expectations soften, another layer of control quietly adapts. It does not disappear, it evolves. It puts on refined language, it adopts calm tones. It uses wisdom instead of force, and because it looks peaceful, it is harder to see. There is a moment when spiritual practice starts to feel empowering. You meditate, you observe your thoughts, you regulate your emotions, you gain insight, and with that insight, a subtle shift can occur. The ego does not vanish, it reorganizes, it learns new strategies, it learns how to control without appearing to. This is where spiritual control takes root. Spiritual control is not loud. It does not dominate conversations or impose rules overtly. It shows up as certainty, as composure, as quiet superiority. It says, "I am beyond this," or "I don't get affected like others do," or "I see things more clearly now." These statements may sound harmless, even true, but when they become identity, they create distance. The ego loves improvement. It loves hierarchy. When spirituality becomes a ladder, the ego climbs it. Meditation becomes proof. Discipline becomes status. Wisdom becomes authority. And control re-enters through refinement. This form of control is especially dangerous because it feels justified. You are not controlling out of fear, you tell yourself. You are being mindful. You are being disciplined. You are being detached. But beneath these words, there may still be avoidance, suppression, or dominance. Meditation, when misused, can become a way to bypass emotion rather than meet it. You sit with discomfort, but instead of allowing it, you dissociate from it. You watch pain from a distance and call it equanimity. But equanimity without contact is numbness. The difference is subtle but important. True presence feels alive. Spiritual control feels flat. Discipline can also become a weapon. You push yourself to meditate longer, practice harder, maintain composure at all costs. You override signals of fatigue, grief, or anger because you believe you should be beyond them. This is control disguised as commitment. Wisdom, too, can become rigid. You adopt concepts about impermanence, non-attachment, or non-self and use them to dismiss lived experience. Someone expresses pain and you respond with philosophy instead of empathy. You explain away suffering instead of meeting it. This is domination through abstraction. Spiritual control often emerges when the ego fears regression. You don't want to go back to who you were. You don't want to feel raw again. You don't want to admit confusion. So you hold tightly to a spiritual identity that promises stability. But spirituality is not meant to stabilize the ego. It is meant to soften it. When practice becomes identity, curiosity fades. You stop questioning your own assumptions. You stop noticing blind spots. You start defending your understanding. Defense is always a sign of control. The subtle ego behind spiritual control often shows up as detachment. You appear calm but unavailable, present but distant. You no longer react, but you also no longer connect. This distance feels safe, but it blocks intimacy. Control creates safety by reducing contact. But growth happens through contact. Spiritual control also affects how you relate to others' suffering. You may see their pain as lower-level consciousness, unresolved karma, or lack of awareness. These interpretations may sound spiritual, but they create hierarchy. Hierarchy blocks compassion. True wisdom does not separate. It recognizes shared vulnerability. There is also a tendency to control inner experience through spiritual practice. You monitor thoughts. You label emotions. You manage reactions. Awareness becomes surveillance. The inner world becomes policed. This creates tension. You are never fully at ease because you are always observing yourself. Self-observation without kindness becomes self-control. Kind awareness allows, controlling awareness restricts. Spiritual control often avoids messiness. It prefers clarity, stillness, and insight. Messy emotions like jealousy, rage, longing, or grief are seen as failures. But these emotions are part of being human. Rejecting them fragments the self. Fragmentation creates shadow. What is rejected does not disappear. It expresses itself indirectly through rigidity, judgment, or superiority. The ego loves being the one who knows. Spiritual language gives it sophisticated tools. You speak of surrender, but only when it does not threaten your image. You speak of acceptance, but only when it aligns with your preferences. This selective application reveals control. Another sign of spiritual control is intolerance of doubt. You may feel unsettled when beliefs are questioned or when practice feels dry. Instead of staying with uncertainty, you double down. More practice, more effort, more certainty. But forcing clarity closes the heart. True practice allows doubt. Doubt is not failure, it is inquiry. It keeps wisdom alive. When doubt is suppressed, practice becomes dogma. Dogma is control crystallized. Spiritual control also shows up in communities. Hierarchies form. Certain experiences are valued more than others. Silence is praised. Emotion is sidelined. People feel pressure to appear calm and evolved. This environment discourages honesty. People hide struggles to maintain belonging. Control replaces authenticity. Authentic spirituality welcomes imperfection. It allows confusion, emotional expression, and questioning. It does not demand performance. Control demands performance. There is also the misuse of non-attachment. Non-attachment is not disengagement, but when misunderstood, it becomes emotional withdrawal. You avoid commitment, you avoid grief, you avoid responsibility, calling it freedom. Freedom without care is avoidance. Spiritual control often avoids accountability. Harm is reframed as lesson. Impact is dismissed as projection. This protects the self-image of wisdom at the expense of relationship. True wisdom listens to impact. It adjusts, it repairs. Repair requires humility. Humility threatens the ego, so spiritual control avoids it by staying abstract. Another subtle form of spiritual control is timing dominance. You tell yourself others will understand later. You position yourself as ahead. This reinforces separation. Awakening does not move in straight lines. There is no ahead or behind. There is only different conditions. When you believe you are ahead, you stop learning from those around you. Learning requires equality. Spiritual control also limits embodiment. You stay in the mind, observing. You avoid sensation, but wisdom is embodied. The body holds truths the mind cannot conceptualize. Avoiding the body keeps practice incomplete. Meditation is meant to open awareness, not narrow it. When meditation becomes rigid, it loses its function. It becomes another task to master. Mastery appeals to the ego. Presence does not. Presence cannot be owned. It cannot be accumulated. It arises and dissolves. Control tries to hold it. When you notice pride around practice, that is a moment of honesty. Pride is not a sin. It is a signal. It points to attachment. Seeing attachment clearly is part of the path. Judging it is not. Spiritual control thrives on comparison. You compare your calm to others' reactivity, your insight to others' confusion. This comparison reinforces identity. Identity always seeks advantage. True practice dissolves comparison by revealing shared humanity. Another sign of spiritual control is urgency to correct others. You offer insights without being asked. You interpret others' experiences through your framework. This is subtle dominance. Wisdom offered without invitation often feels invasive. True guidance waits. It responds rather than imposes. Spiritual control also shows up as rigidity around routine. Missing practice feels like failure. Rest feels like weakness. This is discipline without compassion. Compassion adjusts, control insists. The nervous system feels the difference. Compassionate practice regulates. Controlling practice stresses. Spiritual growth does not require constant effort. Integration happens in rest. Control resists rest because it feels like loss of progress. But progress is not linear. It is cyclical. Forcing linearity distorts growth. Spiritual control also creates fear of collapse. You fear that without discipline, everything will fall apart. This fear reveals a lack of trust. Trust is not blind faith. It is confidence in awareness. Awareness remains even when practice fluctuates. Letting practice breathe allows life to inform wisdom. Wisdom that is disconnected from life becomes brittle. Brittleness is a sign of control. Softness is a sign of integration. Integration allows contradictions. You can be mindful and reactive, wise and confused, grounded and grieving. Control demands consistency. Integration allows complexity. The ego resists complexity. It prefers clarity. But clarity without depth is shallow. Spiritual control also limits joy. You may downplay pleasure, spontaneity, or playfulness in favor of seriousness. This creates dryness. Joy is not a distraction from awakening. It is part of aliveness. Avoiding joy is another form of control. Awakening is not about becoming someone special. It is about becoming available to experience, available to relationship, available to truth. Spiritual control makes you special. It elevates. Availability humbles. Humility opens the heart. Control closes it. When spiritual control softens, practice becomes lighter, less effortful, more sincere. You stop trying to embody wisdom and start listening to life. Life becomes the teacher again. You notice when practice is used to avoid. You notice when concepts are used to dominate. And instead of condemning yourself, you gently return to presence. Presence does not judge misuse, it reveals it. This revelation is freeing. You no longer need to be a certain kind of spiritual person. You can be human. Human spirituality is honest. It admits confusion. It welcomes emotion. It stays curious. When the subtle ego is seen clearly, it loses its grip. Not through force, but through understanding. Understanding dissolves control, and in that dissolution, practice returns to its original purpose. Not to elevate you above life, but to bring you into deeper contact with it. Without domination, without performance, without needing to be someone, just awareness, meeting experience, moment by moment, without needing to control even wisdom itself. As the grip of spiritual control loosens and practice returns to sincerity instead of performance, another form of pressure quietly reveals itself. It is not about doing things right anymore. It is about doing them on time, about arriving, about getting somewhere before something runs out. This pressure hides inside goals, growth, healing, awakening, and even patience itself. There is a familiar tightness that appears when you start asking, how long will this take? A restlessness that says, I should be further along by now. This restlessness does not come from wisdom, it comes from fear. Fear that time is slipping away. Fear that progress is too slow. Fear that if you don't hurry, something essential will be lost. Obsession with time is one of the most socially accepted forms of control. It looks responsible, it looks ambitious, it looks disciplined. But internally, it creates constant anxiety. Anxiety feeds on imagined futures, and timelines are nothing more than imagined futures dressed as certainty. When you attach progress to time, you turn growth into a race. You measure yourself against clocks, calendars, milestones, and other people's journeys. This measurement creates pressure. Pressure activates the nervous system. An activated nervous system cannot integrate experience deeply. Growth that is rushed becomes shallow. Healing that is rushed becomes fragile. Insight that is rushed becomes conceptual rather than embodied. Time obsession also distorts perception. You stop noticing what is changing because you are focused on what hasn't changed yet. Small shifts go unseen. Subtle growth is dismissed. You overlook resilience, wisdom, and capacity that have already developed. The mind believes timelines create motivation. In reality, they often create self-violence. When progress does not match expectation, shame appears. I'm failing. I'm behind. I'm wasting time. These thoughts tighten the body and narrow awareness. Trust cannot grow in a body that feels constantly behind. Buddhist understanding recognizes that time is not experienced linearly in the body. The body does not heal by schedule. Insight does not mature by deadline. Transformation follows rhythms, not clocks. Nature does not rush, yet nothing is delayed. This truth is easy to admire and difficult to live. Modern conditioning teaches urgency. Urgency feels like survival. Slowing down feels risky, but urgency is often a sign of distrust. Distrust that life will unfold without constant pressure. Distrust that your process is valid. Distrust that you are allowed to take the time you need. When you obsess over progress, you turn the present moment into a means rather than an end. The present becomes valuable only for what it produces. This robs life of immediacy. Presence cannot thrive when it is constantly evaluated. Progress fixation also creates a false future self. You imagine a version of yourself who is healed, awakened, calm, complete. This image becomes a destination. You endure the present in order to reach it, but that future self is always elsewhere. When you arrive at one milestone, another appears. Completion keeps moving. This chasing keeps peace postponed. Trust unfolds naturally when you stop demanding arrival. When you release the idea that you must become someone else to be okay, growth continues without pressure. Growth does not stop when control is released. It becomes more organic. Control over time also interferes with learning. Learning requires repetition, mistake, and integration. Timelines reduce learning to outcome. Did I get it yet? Replaces curiosity. Curiosity thrives in spaciousness. Anxiety suffocates it. Obsession with timelines also narrows compassion. You expect others to heal, change, or understand at a certain pace. When they don't, impatience appears. This impatience is often mirrored inwardly. When you soften time expectations for yourself, you naturally soften them for others. This softening deepens relationships. Conversations feel less pressured. Listening improves. You stop waiting for people to change and start meeting them as they are. Releasing control over time also changes how you relate to effort. Effort becomes responsive instead of forced. You act when something is ready to be acted on. You rest when rest is needed. Rest is not wasted time. Rest is integration. Many breakthroughs happen during rest, not effort. When the mind relaxes its grip, insight surfaces naturally. Control interrupts this process by constantly checking progress. Progress checking pulls attention out of experience and into evaluation. Evaluation activates judgment. Judgment creates tension. Trust unfolds when evaluation quiets. Another hidden cost of timeline obsession is fear of aging and mortality. Time pressure is often fear of running out of opportunity, running out of meaning, running out of relevance. This fear drives urgency. Urgency drives control. Control blocks presence. Presence is the only place life is actually lived. When you release control over time, you are not denying mortality. You are changing your relationship to it. You stop racing against it and start living within it. Living within time means honoring seasons. There are seasons of effort and seasons of rest, seasons of clarity and seasons of confusion. Forcing one season to behave like another creates suffering. Trust recognizes seasonality. It does not panic when growth feels slow. It does not cling when growth feels fast. Progress is not linear. It spirals. Old patterns resurface not because you failed, but because deeper layers are ready to be seen. Timeline thinking interprets this as regression. Trust recognizes it as deepening. This recognition reduces discouragement. Discouragement comes from expecting straight lines in a world of cycles. Releasing control over time also changes how you relate to goals. Goals become directions rather than demands. You move toward them, but you are not defined by when you reach them. This reduces fear of failure. Failure becomes information rather than indictment. Information guides adjustment. Indictment freezes movement. Trusting the process also allows for mystery. You do not need to know when or how something will resolve. You only need to stay present and responsive. Responsiveness is different from passivity. It means engaging fully with what is in front of you without forcing what is not ready. This approach conserves energy. You stop fighting imaginary deadlines. Energy returns to awareness. Awareness notices when action is needed and when waiting is wise. Waiting is not delay, it is alignment. Alignment feels calm. Calm supports clarity. Clarity emerges naturally when the nervous system is not under pressure. Pressure collapses clarity into urgency. Releasing control over time also heals the relationship with patience. Patience is not tolerating frustration while waiting for something better. It is being fully present without needing something else to arrive. Patience is presence without demand. This kind of patience is not passive. It is alert, curious, and open. The ego resists patience because patience removes leverage. The ego wants to negotiate with life. Patience listens. Listening reveals subtle shifts that urgency misses. You begin to notice micro-changes, slight softening, increased capacity, shorter recovery times. These changes accumulate. Trust grows when you notice these changes, rather than dismiss them because they don't match expectations. Expectation is the enemy of trust. When expectations loosen, gratitude naturally increases. You appreciate what is happening now rather than fixating on what isn't. Gratitude grounds awareness. Grounded awareness reduces anxiety. Anxiety thrives on future fixation. Trust anchors you in now. Releasing control over time also impacts decision-making. Decisions are no longer rushed to meet imagined deadlines. You allow options to clarify. Clarity that emerges from waiting is often more aligned than clarity forced by pressure. Forced decisions often require later correction. Trust reduces this cycle. There is also humility in releasing time control. You admit you cannot predict everything. You allow life to surprise you. Surprise is not threat, it is aliveness. When you stop micromanaging progress, joy becomes possible again. Joy cannot exist under constant evaluation. Evaluation asks, am I there yet? Joy asks, what is here now? This shift is subtle but profound. Trust does not mean you stop planning. It means you stop worshipping plans. Plans become flexible. Adaptation becomes natural. You no longer feel betrayed when things take longer than expected. You adjust. Adjustment is a sign of intelligence, not failure. Time obsession often comes from comparing paths. You see others who appear ahead. Comparison distorts perception. You do not see their struggles. You only see milestones. Trust returns when you stop comparing timelines and return to lived experience. Your experience is the only one you can inhabit. Measuring it against others creates dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction fuels control. Control blocks peace. Peace does not require completion. It requires presence. Releasing control over progress also allows humility in spiritual practice. You stop measuring insight. You stop ranking experiences. You allow depth to develop quietly. Quiet development is often the most stable. Trust unfolds when you recognize that nothing essential is missing. Growth is happening even when it feels invisible. Roots grow underground before anything appears above the surface. Forcing visibility weakens roots. When you honor unseen growth, you stop demanding proof from yourself. This reduces internal pressure. Pressure is exhausting. Rest returns when trust replaces pressure. Trust is not something you decide intellectually. It emerges through repeated experiences of letting go and discovering that nothing collapses. Each time you release urgency and remain present, trust deepens. You begin to feel time differently. Moments feel fuller. Days feel less rushed. Life feels less like a countdown. You are still moving, still learning, still growing, but without the whip. Progress continues, but it is no longer a burden. And in that shift, something becomes clear. You were never behind. You were always in process. Process does not need to hurry. When you stop trying to outrun time, time becomes an ally rather than an enemy. Trust does not unfold because you force it. It unfolds because you stop interfering. And in that unfolding, anxiety loosens its grip. presence deepens, and life begins to feel less like something you must catch up to, and more like something you are already inside. You've seen it now. Control was never strength. It was protection born from fear. And peace was never something to force, fix, or reach. It was what remained when the struggle stopped. You learned that control hides in many forms: in identity, in timelines, in healing, in certainty, in spirituality itself. You saw how holding tight creates suffering, and how letting go doesn't make life fall apart. It makes it honest. Acceptance is not weakness. Vulnerability is not collapse. Uncertainty is not failure. And peace does not require answers, closure, or perfection. Peace appears when you stop arguing with reality, when you allow emotions without becoming them, when you trust life without abandoning responsibility, when you stop trying to be someone and simply allow yourself to be here. If something in this series touched you, write "I release control" in the comments. Not for anyone else, but as a quiet commitment to yourself. And if you want more teachings like this, calm, deep, and grounded in real inner change, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. No noise, no forcing, just clarity, presence, and a path back to peace. Thank you for being here.